Hey there, and welcome to Crime for Sleep. I know you're having trouble falling asleep, so let me keep you company with true crime stories from around the world. Before we dive in, I'm curious, where did you first hear this one? If you enjoy these stories, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Now get comfortable, and let's get into tonight's case. Story 1. A whiff of charred lemon drifted past me as if someone had just extinguished a kitchen disaster. The faint citrus mingled with smoke, nudging a memory that lurked just beyond grasp. I stood in the hallway where the walls seemed to narrow, squeezing the air that whispered around me. The scent was out of place, lost between old paint and peeling wallpaper, and the shadows shifted uneasily. It pulled at the edges of something half-formed in my mind, a forgotten moment where light flickered and faces blurred. I searched the air for another hint, but the sense of inevitability clung to my skin, an echo that refused to fade. I hadn't smelled that since the night I couldn't forget. The apartment building held its breath around me. My footsteps echoed against linoleum that had seen better decades, each step a small percussion in the hollow space. I was here because of the phone call, the one that came through static and hesitation. A voice I almost recognized, asking if I remembered what happened in the kitchen that night. The voice belonged to someone who claimed to have been there, claimed to have seen what I had done. But I knew I hadn't done anything. At least, I thought I knew. The door to apartment 12 stood slightly ajar, just as the voice had promised it would be. The brass numbers hung crooked, the two tilting away from the one like it was trying to escape. I pushed the door open with my fingertips, feeling the wood give way with a soft creak that seemed to announce my arrival to empty rooms. Inside, the air was thick with that same scent, charred lemon and something else, something metallic that made my tongue feel heavy. The living room stretched before me, furnished with pieces that didn't quite match, as if someone had collected them from different lives and forced them into awkward coexistence. A green couch faced a television that wasn't turned on, its black screen reflecting the weak light from windows covered in gauze curtains. I moved toward the kitchen, drawn by familiarity I couldn't name. The linoleum changed to cracked tile, white squares interrupted by grout that had darkened with age and neglect. The refrigerator hummed with mechanical persistence, a sound that seemed too loud in the stillness. On the counter, a cast iron pan sat on a cold burner, its surface stained with residue that could have been food or could have been something else entirely. The smell was strongest here. I opened the window above the sink, letting in air that carried the distant sounds of traffic and lives being lived in other places. But the scent remained, clinging to the walls like a confession that refused to be aired out. That was when I noticed the photographs. They were tucked behind the toaster, 3 Polaroids with edges that had been handled too much. The first showed a kitchen that looked almost like this one, but cleaner, brighter. A woman stood at the stove, her back to the camera, stirring something in the same cast iron pan. Her hair was pulled back in a way that seemed both casual and careful, and she wore a yellow dress that caught the light from an overhead fixture. The second photograph showed the same woman, but now she was facing the camera. Her smile was wide but didn't reach her eyes, and there was something in her expression that made me look away and then look back, as if I was trying to solve a puzzle with pieces that kept changing shape. Behind her, the stove glowed with flame, and smoke rose from the pan in delicate spirals. The third photograph was different. The kitchen was dark, illuminated only by what looked like the flash of the camera itself. The woman was gone, but the pan remained on the stove, and something dark had spilled across the white tile floor. The image was blurry, as if the photographer's hands had been shaking, but I could make out shapes that suggested struggle, suggested things that had been knocked over and left where they fell. I set the photographs down and noticed my hands were trembling. Not from fear, exactly, but from recognition that came in waves, each one bringing me closer to something I wasn't sure I wanted to remember. The phone call had come while I was eating dinner, a simple meal that I had prepared without thinking, muscle memory guiding my hands through familiar motions. The voice on the other end was distorted, either by poor connection or deliberate disguise, but the words were clear enough. They knew what I had done. They had evidence. They wanted to meet. But what had I done? I tried to trace my memory back to that night, the one the voice had referenced, the one that seemed to hover at the edges of my consciousness like smoke from a fire I couldn't quite see. There had been a kitchen, that much I was certain of. There had been the smell of lemon, sharp and bright before it turned acrid. There had been a woman, someone whose face I could almost picture but never quite bring into focus. I walked back to the living room, studying the space for clues I might have missed. The couch cushions were arranged too carefully, as if someone had tried to erase the impression of bodies that had once sat there. The coffee table held a single magazine, open to an article about memory and trauma, about how the mind protects itself by forgetting things too painful to hold. In the corner, a small desk supported a computer that looked like it hadn't been used in months. Dust had settled on the keyboard in a pattern that suggested fingers had once moved across the keys with purpose, but those days were long past. I pressed the power button and waited as the machine wheezed to life, its fan spinning with mechanical reluctance. The desktop contained only a few folders, most of them empty or filled with documents that seemed ordinary enough. But buried in a folder labeled with a series of numbers was a collection of audio files. I clicked on the first one and heard my own voice, clear and unmistakable, speaking words I didn't remember saying. "I never meant for it to happen," my voice said through the computer's small speakers. She was supposed to understand. She was supposed to listen. The recording continued, my voice growing more agitated, more desperate. I described a kitchen, a woman in a yellow dress, a conversation that had gone wrong in ways I couldn't quite articulate. I talked about the smell of lemons, about how she had been making something special, something that was supposed to fix everything between us. But who was she and what had needed fixing? I clicked on the second file and heard a different voice, a woman's voice that seemed to respond to mine across some impossible distance. She sounded tired, resigned, as if she had been having the same conversation for longer than either of us could remember. "You always say that," she said. "You always say you didn't mean it. But meaning and doing are different things, aren't they? You can mean all the right things and still end up with blood on your hands." Blood on my hands. I looked down at my palms, searching for stains that weren't there, for evidence of something I couldn't remember doing. The skin was clean, ordinary, marked only by the small scars and calluses that accumulate through ordinary living. But the woman's voice continued, describing a scene that felt both foreign and familiar. "The lemon cake was supposed to be a peace offering," she said. "You knew it was my favorite. You knew I couldn't stay angry when you made an effort like that. But you burned it, didn't you? You burned it because you were too busy arguing, too busy trying to make me admit I was wrong about everything." A lemon cake, the memory came back in fragments, like pieces of a photograph that had been torn apart and scattered. I could see flour on a counter, eggs cracked into a bowl, the bright yellow of lemon zest against white ceramic. I could feel the frustration building as the conversation grew more heated, as words were said that couldn't be taken back. But I couldn't see her face. Every time I tried to focus on the woman in the memory, she seemed to blur and shift, as if she was made of smoke rather than flesh and bone. The third audio file contained only breathing, long stretches of silence broken by the soft sound of someone trying to calm themselves. In the background, I could hear kitchen sounds, the sizzle of something in a pan, the opening and closing of cabinet doors, the clink of dishes being moved from one place to another. It was domestic and peaceful, but underneath it all was a tension that made my chest feel tight. Then came the sound of raised voices, too distorted by distance and poor recording quality to make out specific words, but clear enough to convey anger, frustration, fear. The breathing on the recording became more rapid, more shallow, as if the person holding the device was trying not to be heard. The voices stopped abruptly, replaced by a sound I couldn't immediately identify. It was wet and heavy, like something being dragged across a hard surface. Then came silence, broken only by the continued breathing of the person making the recording. I closed the audio files and leaned back in the desk chair, trying to make sense of what I had heard. The voice in the recordings was mine, but I had no memory of the conversations they captured. The woman's voice was familiar in the way that voices from dreams are familiar, recognizable but impossible to place in waking life. I returned to the kitchen, drawn by questions that seemed to multiply rather than resolve themselves. The photographs were still there behind the toaster, but now I noticed something I had missed before. In the background of the first image, barely visible but unmistakably present, was a figure standing in the doorway. The person was mostly in shadow, but I could make out the suggestion of someone watching, someone who wasn't supposed to be there. I held the photograph closer to the window, using the natural light to reveal details that had been hidden in the apartment's dim interior. The figure was tall, wearing what looked like a dark jacket or coat. Their face was obscured, but their posture suggested tension, readiness, as if they were prepared to act at any moment. In the second photograph, the one where the woman was smiling at the camera, the figure was gone. But now I could see something else in the background, the edge of what looked like a recording device, sitting on the counter near the stove. Someone had been documenting this scene, preserving it for reasons I couldn't understand. The third photograph, the dark one with the spilled contents of the pan, showed no people at all. But the recording device was still there, its small red light visible even in the camera's harsh flash. Someone had continued recording, even after whatever had happened in this kitchen had reached its conclusion. I set the photographs down and opened the refrigerator, not sure what I was looking for but compelled to search anyway. The shelves were mostly empty, containing only the basics: milk that had passed its expiration date, a few condiments, some leftovers wrapped in foil. But in the crisper drawer, I found something that made my hands shake again. Lemons, a bag of them still fresh, their skin bright and unblemished. They seemed to glow in the refrigerator's light, as if they were the only real things in this apartment full of shadows and half-remembered scenes. I took one of the lemons and held it to my nose, breathing in the sharp, clean scent that had nothing in common with the charred smell that permeated the apartment. But as I stood there, the lemon in my hands, another memory began to surface. I was standing in a different kitchen, one that was brighter and more lived in than this sterile space. The woman in the yellow dress was there, but now I could see her face clearly. She was younger than I had expected, with eyes that held both affection and wariness, as if she had learned to love carefully. "You don't have to do this," she was saying, her hands moving efficiently as she prepared ingredients for something that smelled of citrus and vanilla. "I know you're trying to apologize, but grand gestures aren't what I need right now." But I had insisted, hadn't I? I had taken over the preparation, convinced that I could do it better, that my effort would mean more than hers. I had zested the lemons with aggressive strokes, had measured the flour with the precision of someone trying to prove a point rather than create something delicious. The argument had started over something small, something that shouldn't have mattered, but it had grown, fed by older grievances and unspoken resentments, until we were no longer talking about cake or cooking or even the specific thing that had triggered the disagreement. We were talking about everything that was wrong between us, everything that had been building in the spaces we pretended didn't exist. And then the cake had burned. I could remember the smell now, the way the sweet scent of baking had turned bitter and acrid as the oven's heat transformed sugar into carbon. I could remember the smoke alarm going off, its shrill cry cutting through our raised voices and forcing us to acknowledge that something had gone very wrong. But what had happened next? The memory ended there, cut off as if someone had stopped a recording in the middle of a crucial scene. I walked back to the computer and opened the audio files again, listening more carefully this time for clues I might have missed. In the background of the second recording, behind the woman's tired voice, I could hear something that sounded like typing. Someone was documenting our conversation even as it happened, creating a record of words that were supposed to be private. Who had been watching us? Who had cared enough about our argument to preserve it for future examination? I thought about the figure in the photograph, the person standing in the doorway while the woman cooked. The posture had suggested familiarity, as if this person belonged in the scene but was choosing to remain on its periphery. A friend, perhaps, or a family member who had grown tired of mediating our conflicts. Or someone with a different kind of interest in our relationship, someone who had reasons of their own for wanting to document its dissolution. The apartment around me felt less empty now, as if it was filled with the ghosts of conversations and confrontations that had played out in these rooms. I could almost hear the echo of voices, the sound of footsteps moving from room to room, the opening and closing of doors that led to revelations I wasn't sure I was prepared to face. I returned to the living room and examined the magazine on the coffee table more carefully. The article about memory and trauma was marked with annotations in the margins, notes written in handwriting that looked familiar but which I couldn't quite place. The annotations focused on passages about repressed memories, about the way the mind sometimes chooses forgetting over healing. One passage was highlighted in yellow. The brain's capacity for self-protection can sometimes work against the individual's need for truth. What we choose not to remember may be as significant as what we choose to preserve. Underneath this passage, someone had written, "But what if the forgetting isn't a choice? What if someone else decides what you're allowed to remember?" The question sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the apartment's inadequate heating. I thought about the audio recordings, about the way my own voice had described events I couldn't recall. I thought about the photographs, about the figure watching from the doorway while scenes of domestic tension played out in the kitchen. What if my memory hadn't failed on its own? What if someone had helped it along, guiding me away from truths that were inconvenient or dangerous? I searched the apartment more systematically now, looking for evidence of manipulation or coercion. In the bedroom, I found clothes that seemed too small for the space's current occupant, dresses and blouses that suggested a woman had lived here recently. The closet held a few men's items as well, shirts and pants that looked like they might fit me, though I had no memory of ever wearing them. On the nightstand, a small notebook contained what looked like observations about daily routines and behavioral patterns. The entries were written in the same handwriting as the magazine annotations, and they described someone who sounded uncomfortably like me. Subject continues to show signs of selective amnesia regarding events of that evening. Memory gaps appear to be widening rather than narrowing with time. Recommend continued monitoring to ensure stability of current narrative. Subject, the word made me feel like a specimen under observation, something to be studied rather than someone to be helped. I flipped through more pages, finding entries that detailed my movements, my habits, my apparent state of mind over what seemed to be a period of several months. Subject visited the old neighborhood again today, stood outside the house for approximately 20 minutes before leaving without making contact. Suggest intervention may be necessary if these visits continue. Subject has been asking questions about the night in question, claims to have no memory of events between arrival at location and waking up the next morning in unfamiliar surroundings. Story remains consistent, which is either genuine or indicates sophisticated preparation. The entries painted a picture of someone living under surveillance, someone whose every move was being documented and analyzed. But they also suggested that I had been actively trying to recover memories that someone else wanted to keep buried. I closed the notebook and sat on the edge of the bed, trying to process what I had discovered. The apartment wasn't just a meeting place or a neutral location for confronting uncomfortable truths. It was a stage carefully prepared for a performance in which I was both actor and audience. But who was the director, and what was the purpose of this elaborate production? The answer came to me gradually, assembled from fragments of memory and observation like a puzzle whose pieces had been scattered across multiple rooms. The woman in the yellow dress hadn't been a victim. She had been a participant, someone who had chosen to document our final confrontation for reasons that had nothing to do with preserving truth and everything to do with creating a specific version of events. The figure in the doorway hadn't been a casual observer. They had been a collaborator, someone who had helped to stage the scene and record the evidence that would later be used to construct a narrative in which I was the perpetrator of something I couldn't remember doing. And the apartment itself wasn't a random location where truth would finally be revealed. It was a carefully constructed environment designed to reinforce the story they wanted me to believe, complete with props and recordings that seemed to confirm my guilt while providing no actual evidence of a crime. I stood up and walked back to the kitchen, seeing it now with different eyes. The cast iron pan on the stove wasn't evidence of violence. It was a theatrical prop, stained with substances that were meant to suggest something sinister without actually proving anything. The photographs weren't documentation of real events. They were staged scenes, carefully composed to create the impression of a narrative that existed only in the minds of their creators. Even the smell of charred lemon wasn't a memory trigger. It was an artificial scent, designed to create a sense of familiarity and dread that would make me more susceptible to the story being constructed around me. But why? What could be gained by convincing me that I had committed a crime that apparently hadn't happened? The answer to that question remained elusive, hidden somewhere in the spaces between what I could remember and what I had been told to believe. But as I stood in that kitchen, surrounded by the elaborate fiction that had been built to contain me, I felt something I hadn't experienced since this whole ordeal began. Doubt not about my own innocence, but about the motives of those who had worked so hard to convince me of my guilt. The phone rang, cutting through my thoughts with mechanical insistence. I found it on the counter next to the stove, an old rotary model that seemed out of place in the modern apartment. I picked up the receiver and heard the same distorted voice that had brought me here. "Have you figured it out yet?" the voice asked. I looked around the kitchen, taking in the carefully arranged props and staged evidence. "Some of it," I said. "And what do you plan to do with what you've learned?" That was the question, wasn't it? I could leave this apartment and try to resume the life I had been living before, pretending that none of this had happened. I could accept the version of events that had been constructed for me, carrying the weight of a crime I hadn't committed but couldn't definitively prove I was innocent of. Or I could keep digging, following the threads of deception back to their source, risking the discovery of truths that might be more complicated and dangerous than the fiction I was being asked to embrace. "I'm still deciding," I said. The voice on the other end was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Be careful what you choose to remember. Some truths are more dangerous than the lies that replace them." The line went dead, leaving me alone in the kitchen with the smell of charred lemon and the weight of questions that seemed to multiply with every answer I discovered. I set the phone down and walked to the window, looking out at a city that stretched beyond the apartment's carefully constructed boundaries. Somewhere out there were the real answers to the questions that had brought me here. Somewhere out there was the truth about what had happened that night, about who I really was, and about why someone had gone to such elaborate lengths to convince me I was someone else entirely. The evening light was fading, casting long shadows across the kitchen floor. Soon it would be dark, and I would have to decide whether to leave this place and its manufactured mysteries behind, or to stay and continue unraveling a story that seemed to grow more complex with every thread I pulled. I picked up the photographs one more time, studying the faces and figures that had been arranged to tell a story I no longer believed. The woman in the yellow dress looked back at me with that smile that didn't reach her eyes, and I wondered if she had known, even then, that she was performing for an audience that extended far beyond the camera's lens. The scent of charred lemon still lingered in the air, artificial but persistent, a reminder that some stories are designed to stay with us long after we've stopped believing in their truth. I breathed it in one last time, then opened the window wider, letting the real air of the real world begin to clear away the manufactured atmosphere of this carefully constructed deception. Whatever happened next, I would face it with the knowledge that memory and truth are not always the same thing, and that sometimes the most important mysteries are not about what we've forgotten, but about who wants us to forget it. Story 2. My breath caught momentary and sharp as the mirror showed a reflection I half recognized. The morning routine unfolded: coffee steps, quiet hums, but the scent was all wrong, a note missing from the melody. Over the bathroom sink, the toothbrush lay misplaced, its bristles pointing toward a spot on the wall that never carried meaning before. My hand reached instinctively, and for a heartbeat it felt like reaching through mist. When I withdrew, the bristles were still wet. The logical explanation came easily. My roommate had stayed over again, despite what we'd agreed. The subtle disruption to my carefully ordered morning made sense now. Someone else had moved through these spaces while I slept. The coffee maker still held warmth from an earlier brew, and the bathroom carried that faint humidity that lingers after another person's shower. Simple enough. I'd found the spare key missing from its hiding spot 3 weeks ago. When I asked about it, the response came with that familiar half smile and shrug. Must have dropped it somewhere. But spare keys have a way of finding their way back to the people who need them most. The relationship had ended months ago, officially, but some endings refuse to stay clean. Some people drift back like smoke under a door. The evidence supported this version: the coffee, the displaced toothbrush, the lingering scent of a shampoo I didn't use. The apartment felt lived in beyond my own presence, marked by someone else's casual passage through my morning ritual. It happened before those mornings when I'd wake to find small signs of nocturnal visits. A glass in the sink I didn't remember using, the thermostat adjusted by 2 degrees, the television remote on the wrong side of the couch. But something about the toothbrush bothered me, the way it pointed toward that particular spot on the wall, like an arrow indicating something important. I'd lived in this apartment for 2 years, and that section of wall had never drawn my attention. Plain white paint, no markings, no imperfections, yet now it seemed to pulse with significance. The wet bristles troubled me too, not damp from humidity, but genuinely wet, as if someone had just finished using it. My ex had never used my toothbrush before, had always brought their own during previous stays. The thought of someone else's mouth on something so personal sent an uncomfortable chill through my chest. I pressed my palm against the wall where the toothbrush had been pointing. The paint felt slightly warm, though the morning air carried a distinct coolness. Beneath my hand, I could swear I felt the faintest vibration, like machinery running somewhere deep within the building's bones. But this was an old building, full of pipes and electrical systems that groaned and hummed with their own mysterious rhythms. The reflection in the mirror caught my attention again. Something about my own face seemed unfamiliar, as if I were looking at a photograph of myself taken by someone else. The lighting fell differently across my features, creating shadows in places where shadows shouldn't exist. I blinked hard, expecting the image to correct itself, but the strangeness persisted. In the kitchen, I discovered the coffee maker hadn't been used at all. The carafe sat clean and dry, exactly as I'd left it the night before. The warmth I'd felt earlier must have been residual heat from the dishwasher's drying cycle, which ran on an automatic timer. But I distinctly remembered feeling steam, seeing the faint condensation on the glass pot. My memory felt unreliable, like trying to hold water in cupped hands. The more I focused on the details of the morning, the more they seemed to shift and rearrange themselves. Had I actually seen steam, or had I expected to see it? Had the toothbrush really been pointing at the wall, or had I imagined that detail in my half-awake state? The apartment suddenly felt too quiet, as if sound itself had been absorbed by the walls. Even my footsteps seemed muffled as I moved from room to room, searching for other signs of intrusion. But everything else appeared exactly as I'd left it. The books on the shelf maintained their careful arrangement. The cushions on the couch held only the impressions from my own evening routine. The bed showed no evidence of another body having shared the space. Yet the wrongness persisted, a frequency just below the threshold of hearing. The air itself felt different, thicker somehow, as if someone had been breathing it before me. I found myself taking deeper breaths, trying to clear my lungs of something I couldn't name. Standing in the living room, I experienced a sudden flash of memory that felt both familiar and impossible. I saw myself entering the apartment the night before, but not alone. A figure moved behind me, close enough that I should have been aware of their presence, yet somehow remaining just outside my conscious recognition. The memory felt real and false simultaneously, like recalling a dream so vivid it bleeds into waking life. The sensation of reaching through mist returned, stronger now. My hands felt disconnected from my body, moving through space that offered no resistance. When I touched objects, the doorknob, the light switch, the surface of the kitchen counter, they felt insubstantial, as if they might dissolve under pressure. I returned to the bathroom, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't explain. The toothbrush now lay in its proper position, bristles pointing away from the wall, but the spot on the wall still commanded attention, still seemed to throb with hidden meaning. I pressed my ear against the paint and heard something that might have been breathing, or might have been the building settling, or might have been my own pulse amplified by anxiety. The mirror reflection had changed again. Now my face looked exactly as it should, familiar and unremarkable. But I could swear I saw movement in the background, a shadow that didn't correspond to anything in the actual room. When I turned to look directly, nothing was there. When I looked back at the mirror, the shadow had vanished. Time seemed unreliable too. I'd entered the bathroom moments ago, but the light coming through the window suggested hours had passed. Or perhaps it was the same light and my perception of its quality had shifted. The morning felt suspended, caught between what had happened and what might be happening still. The wet toothbrush made sense if someone else had used it, but it also made sense if I had used it myself and simply forgotten, lost in the haze of routine that makes mornings blur together. How many times do we perform actions so automatically that they leave no trace in memory? How many mornings had I brushed my teeth and forgotten immediately afterward? But the wrongness of the scent remained unexplained. My bathroom had always smelled like my soap, my shampoo, my life. This morning it carried notes of something else not unpleasant, but foreign, like walking into a room that looks identical to your own, but belongs to someone else entirely. I found myself questioning everything now. Had I actually seen the toothbrush pointing at the wall, or had I constructed that detail to explain the unease I felt? Had there really been warmth from the coffee maker, or had my mind supplied that sensation to support the theory of an intruder? Memory and imagination began to blend, creating a narrative that felt true but couldn't be verified. The apartment around me seemed to pulse with possibilities. Every object held the potential for multiple explanations. The morning light could be natural or artificial. The sounds from neighboring units could be genuine or imagined. Even my own presence felt questionable, as if I might be the intruder in someone else's space, someone else's morning routine. Standing in the center of my living room, I realized I couldn't be certain of anything anymore. The toothbrush pointed in whatever direction I needed it to point. The mirror showed whatever face I expected to see. The morning unfolded according to whichever version of events felt most real in any given moment. But beneath all the uncertainty, one sensation remained constant. The feeling of reaching through mist, of touching things that weren't quite there, of moving through a space that existed somewhere between memory and reality. Whether someone else had been in my apartment or whether I was losing my grip on the solid world around me, I couldn't say. Both possibilities felt equally true, equally terrifying, equally impossible to prove. The wet bristles had dried now, but I could still feel their dampness against my fingertips, a phantom sensation that lingered like an unanswered question. Story 3. The security system was deactivated when I arrived. All recorded timestamps remained consistent with the logged data. Corridors were empty, with chairs aligned perfectly against the walls. The blinds in each room were drawn, ensuring no outside visibility. In the central office, papers were stacked according to departmental protocol, untouched and unmarked. An open drawer revealed a single item and envelope, sealed and unaddressed. Every clock displayed identical times, except the one in the break room, which had stopped at precisely 4:42 p.m. Yet there was no record of anyone leaving early. The fluorescent light. The overhead fluorescents hummed with that familiar electrical drone, but something felt different about their rhythm. I stood beneath them, counting the subtle variations in their frequency. Normally I wouldn't notice such details, but the silence made everything amplified. The lights cast their usual harsh shadows across the linoleum, creating geometric patterns that seemed more pronounced than I remembered. One fixture flickered intermittently, the third one from the left in the main hallway. I had walked this corridor countless times, yet I couldn't recall that particular light ever malfunctioning before. The maintenance log should have documented any electrical issues, but when I checked, the pages showed only routine inspections with no anomalies reported. The coffee maker. The break room coffee maker sat cold and unplugged, its carafe empty and clean. This struck me as odd because someone always left the machine on standby, ready for the next morning's first brew. The power cord was coiled neatly beside it, as if someone had deliberately prepared it for storage. I touched the heating plate, completely cool, suggesting it had been off for hours. Yet the coffee filters were still stocked, and the bag of grounds sat open beside the machine, as if interrupted mid-preparation. A single coffee mug rested in the sink, rinsed but not dried, water droplets still clinging to its ceramic surface. The mug belonged to someone who preferred their coffee black, evidenced by the absence of cream residue or sugar crystals. The ventilation system. Air moved through the building with mechanical precision, but I detected an unusual staleness in its circulation. The vents pushed the same recycled atmosphere through each room, carrying traces of familiar scents: copy machine toner, industrial carpet cleaner, the faint remnant of someone's lunch. But underneath these recognizable odors lurked something else, something I couldn't identify. It reminded me of the smell that lingers in a room after many people have gathered and then suddenly departed. The air felt thick, as if it held the weight of recent conversations, though the building appeared to have been empty for hours. The elevator asterisk. The elevator doors stood open on the ground floor, which violated standard protocol. These doors were programmed to close automatically after 30 seconds, yet they remained agape as if frozen mid-cycle. I stepped inside and noticed the button panel showed no recently pressed floors. All buttons were dark and unlit. But the elevator car itself bore subtle signs of recent use. Scuff marks on the floor that hadn't been there during my last inspection, and a faint impression on the back wall where someone might have lain. The emergency phone handset hung slightly askew in its cradle, suggesting it had been recently handled. When I pressed the button for the second floor, the elevator responded normally, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it had been waiting for someone. The supply closet. The supply closet door was locked, as always, but the key hung from its designated hook instead of being secured in the key box. This represented a clear deviation from security protocol. Through the narrow window in the door, I could see shelves lined with office supplies, boxes of paper, printer cartridges, cleaning supplies. Everything appeared orderly, yet something about the arrangement seemed deliberately staged. A box of copy paper sat slightly askew on the middle shelf, its corner protruding beyond the shelf's edge. In all my years of maintaining this facility, I had never seen supplies stored so carelessly. The cleaning staff prided themselves on precision, and this minor disarray felt like a message left in a language I didn't understand. The computer terminals. Each workstation displayed the standard screensaver, cycling through corporate images with mechanical regularity. The monitors glowed with identical blue-tinted light, casting an eerie uniformity across the workspace. I checked the login logs on several machines. All showed normal logout procedures at the end of the previous workday. Yet the keyboards bore the warm residue of recent use, and one mouse pad showed a slight depression where a hand had rested. The chairs were pushed in neatly, but their hydraulic heights varied, as if each had been adjusted by someone of different stature. One terminal showed a slight variation in its screensaver timing, suggesting it had been restarted more recently than the others. The filing cabinets. Metal filing cabinets lined the east wall, each drawer labeled with departmental codes and date ranges. Every drawer was locked, but I noticed something peculiar about the locking mechanisms. Several showed tiny scratches around the keyholes, fresh marks in the metal that hadn't been there during my last security inspection. The scratches were subtle, barely visible unless viewed from a specific angle under the fluorescent lights. They suggested someone had been working with keys in dim lighting, perhaps fumbling with unfamiliar locks. The master key ring in my pocket contained copies of every lock in the building, yet I couldn't recall anyone requesting access to these particular files recently. The water cooler. The water cooler in the corner gurgled occasionally, releasing air bubbles that rose through the clear plastic reservoir. This was normal behavior, but the timing of the bubbles seemed more frequent than usual. I examined the water level and noticed it was lower than expected, suggesting recent consumption. Paper cups were stacked neatly beside the dispenser, but the top cup showed a slight indentation, as if someone had picked it up and then replaced it. A small puddle of water had formed beneath the cooler, not unusual, except that the cleaning staff typically mopped such spills before leaving each evening. The water was clear and odorless, but its presence suggested someone had used the cooler after the cleaning crew's departure. The window blind. Every window in the building had its blinds drawn tight, blocking any view of the exterior. This was unusual because the blinds were typically left partially open to allow natural light during daytime hours. The slats were angled downward, creating a fortress-like atmosphere that felt deliberately isolating. I tested one set of blinds and they moved smoothly on their tracks, showing no mechanical problems. Yet someone had taken the time to close every single window covering in the building, a task that would require considerable effort and purpose. The blind cords hung at identical lengths, suggesting systematic rather than casual adjustment. The trash receptacles. Waste baskets throughout the building were empty, lined with fresh plastic bags. This indicated the cleaning crew had completed their rounds as scheduled. However, I noticed something odd about the placement of the receptacles. Several had been moved slightly from their usual positions, subtle shifts that created small gaps between the baskets and the desks they served. These movements were minimal, perhaps only inches, but they disrupted the careful geometry of the workspace. It was as if someone had searched behind or beneath each receptacle and then replaced them imprecisely. The plastic bag liners were crisp and new, but one bag showed a small tear near the bottom, suggesting it had been removed and replaced. The emergency exit sign. Red exit signs glowed steadily throughout the building, their battery backup systems functioning normally. These signs were tested monthly, and all documentation showed they were in perfect working order. But I noticed that one sign, the one above the rear exit, flickered almost imperceptibly. The flicker was so subtle that it might have been dismissed as an optical illusion, but it occurred at regular intervals like a coded signal. I stood beneath it for several minutes, timing the pattern. The flicker repeated every 47 seconds, a timing that matched no standard electrical cycle I knew. When I checked the maintenance records for this particular sign, I found they were current, with no reported malfunctions. The telephone system. The main telephone console showed all lines inactive, with no calls in progress or on hold. This was expected for after-hours operation, but the message indicator light blinked steadily, suggesting voicemails awaited retrieval. I accessed the voicemail system and found 3 new messages, all received within the past hour. The messages contained only silence, no voice, no background noise, just empty audio lasting exactly 30 seconds each before disconnecting. The caller identification showed internal extensions, indicating the calls originated from within the building. I checked those extensions and found them all properly logged out, with no indication of recent use. The photocopier. The large photocopier in the document center stood silent and cool, its digital display showing a ready status. The paper trays were fully loaded, and the toner levels appeared adequate for normal operation, but the glass scanning surface bore smudges and fingerprints that hadn't been there during my previous inspection. The cleaning crew was meticulous about maintaining the copier's glass surface, yet these marks were clearly recent. I examined the usage counter and noted it showed 3 additional copies since the last recorded use. The copy logbook showed no entries for these additional copies, suggesting someone had used the machine without following proper documentation procedures. The first aid kit asterisk. The wall-mounted first aid kit in the main corridor appeared undisturbed, its plastic case sealed and dust-free. The inventory checklist attached to the front showed all items accounted for as of the last monthly inspection. However, when I opened the case to conduct a routine check, I discovered several items had been moved from their designated compartments. Band-aids were mixed with gauze pads, and the antiseptic wipes were stored where the adhesive tape should have been. Someone had accessed this kit recently and reorganized its contents according to a different system. The supplies themselves were complete, but their rearrangement suggested someone unfamiliar with standard first aid kit organization had been searching for specific items. The security camera housing. Surveillance cameras were positioned throughout the building, their dark lenses surveying empty corridors and vacant offices. The housings appeared intact, and all indicator lights showed normal operation. But I noticed that one camera, the unit monitoring the central hallway, had been adjusted slightly. The angle was perhaps 5 degrees off from its standard position, creating a small blind spot near the elevator entrance. This adjustment was subtle enough to avoid casual notice, but significant enough to compromise coverage of a critical area. The camera's mounting bracket showed no signs of loosening or mechanical failure, suggesting the adjustment had been deliberate and precise. The envelope. I returned to the central office and examined the envelope more carefully. It was standard business size, white paper with no distinguishing marks or characteristics. The seal was perfect, applied with precision and care. The envelope's weight suggested it contained several sheets of paper, but I couldn't determine the contents without breaking the seal. No postal marks indicated it had been delivered through normal mail channels. The paper was clean and unwrinkled, suggesting recent placement in the drawer. I held it up to the light, hoping to discern some detail of its contents, but the paper was too opaque to reveal anything meaningful. The clock. The break room clock remained frozen at 4:42 p.m., its second hand motionless between the 8 and 9 positions. This was a standard battery-operated wall clock, identical to several others throughout the building. I removed it from the wall and examined the battery compartment. The batteries were properly installed and showed adequate charge when tested. The clock's mechanism appeared undamaged, yet it refused to advance beyond that specific time. When I installed fresh batteries, the clock resumed normal operation, but within minutes it stopped again at exactly 11:42 p.m. This behavior suggested some internal damage or deliberate manipulation that affected only the timekeeping function while leaving the display intact. The heating system. The building's heating system cycled on and off according to its programmed schedule, maintaining comfortable temperatures throughout the facility. But I noticed irregularities in the airflow patterns. Certain vents delivered warmer air than others, creating microclimates within individual rooms. The thermostat readings were consistent, but the actual temperature distribution suggested someone had adjusted the dampers in the ductwork. These adjustments would require access to areas typically restricted to maintenance personnel. The changes were subtle but deliberate, creating temperature variations that might encourage people to gather in specific areas while avoiding others. The parking lot. Through a gap in the blinds, I glimpsed the parking lot outside. It was empty except for my own vehicle, exactly as expected for after-hours operation. The asphalt surface was clean and unmarked, recently sealed and striped. Security lighting illuminated the entire area with steady, even coverage. But I noticed tire marks near the loading dock, fresh tracks that suggested a vehicle had been parked there recently. The marks were faint, visible only because they disturbed the thin layer of dust that had accumulated on the asphalt. These tracks didn't match the tread pattern of any authorized service vehicles, and no deliveries were scheduled for this time period. The final detail. I made one last circuit through the building, checking each room systematically. Everything appeared normal, yet the accumulation of small anomalies created an overwhelming sense that something significant had occurred here. In the final office, I discovered one last detail that crystallized my unease. A desk calendar showed today's date, but someone had drawn a small circle around tomorrow's date with a pencil. The mark was light, almost invisible, but deliberate. No appointments were scheduled for tomorrow, and the building would remain closed for the weekend. Yet someone had marked that date as if it held special significance, leaving behind this tiny signal like a breadcrumb in a vast forest of normalcy. Story 4. My fingers lingered on the rough edge of the countertop. The chilled air pressed closely, wrapping around my arms and sending a shiver through my skin. I could feel the floor's cool stone beneath my bare feet, a sensation both grounding and unnervingly slippery. A draft slid through the room, carrying with it a scent that was unfamiliar yet intimate, like a forgotten memory surfacing without warning. Something small had shifted. The mist in the room seemed to thicken ever so slightly, altering the way shadows clung to the ceiling. And in that moment, everything felt impossibly fragile. The kitchen knife lay exactly where I remembered placing it. Its blade caught the pale morning light filtering through the window, creating a thin line of silver that seemed to pulse with each passing cloud. The handle bore the faint impressions of fingers mine, I assumed, though the grip felt foreign when I picked it up again. I had used it the night before to slice vegetables for dinner, yet something about its weight seemed different now, heavier somehow, as if it carried more than just the memory of preparing food. The refrigerator hummed its familiar tune, but the rhythm struck me as slightly off-kilter. I opened it and found the leftovers from our meal still wrapped in clear plastic, untouched. The container of soup sat on the middle shelf, its surface congealed into an unappetizing film. I couldn't recall why we hadn't finished eating. The conversation had been pleasant enough, hadn't it? We talked about ordinary things, work, the weather, plans for the weekend. Yet the food remained, abandoned mid-meal, as if something had interrupted us. The dining room chair sat pushed back from the table at an odd angle. Not quite the way someone would leave it after standing up normally, but tilted as if whoever had been sitting there had risen quickly, perhaps startled. The cushion still held a slight depression, the fabric wrinkled in a pattern that suggested prolonged sitting followed by abrupt departure. I tried to remember the sequence of events, but the details felt slippery, like trying to hold water in cupped hands. The wine glasses remained on the table, one still half full of red wine that had darkened overnight. The other glass sat empty, though I distinctly remembered pouring equal amounts. A ring of burgundy residue marked where the wine had been, suggesting it had been consumed rather than spilled. The bottle stood between them, its label facing away from me, as if deliberately turned to hide its identity. When I rotated it, the vintage year seemed familiar, though I couldn't place where I had seen it before. The living room carpet showed the faint impression of footsteps leading from the dining area toward the front door. The pattern wasn't clear enough to determine the size or type of shoe, but the spacing suggested someone walking with purpose, not the casual shuffle of someone heading to bed. I followed the invisible trail, my own bare feet silent on the thick pile. The impressions grew fainter as they approached the entryway, disappearing entirely near the threshold. The front door lock showed no signs of tampering, its brass surface unmarked and smooth. The deadbolt sat in the locked position, just as I remembered setting it before dinner. Yet something about the mechanism felt loose when I tested it, as if it had been turned recently. The key hung on its usual hook by the door, but it seemed to dangle at a slightly different angle than normal, catching the light in a way that drew my attention. The coat closet held the usual collection of jackets and outerwear, but one hanger swayed gently despite the absence of any air current. A dark wool coat that I didn't immediately recognize hung there, its fabric still slightly damp with morning dew. The pockets bulged with unseen contents, and when I reached toward them, my hand hesitated. The material felt expensive, well-tailored, but unfamiliar to my touch. The staircase to the second floor creaked on the 7th step, just as it always had. But ascending in the dim morning light, I noticed a small scuff mark on the wooden banister that hadn't been there before. The mark appeared fresh, as if something hard had scraped against the polished surface recently. My own hands knew every inch of this railing, worn smooth by years of daily use, yet this blemish felt like an intrusion into familiar territory. The bedroom door stood slightly ajar, though I was certain I had closed it completely the night before. The gap was narrow, perhaps an inch, but it created a thin vertical line of deeper shadow that seemed to watch me approach. The brass doorknob felt cold against my palm, colder than the ambient temperature would justify. When I pushed the door open, it moved silently on well-oiled hinges, revealing the room beyond. The bed lay unmade, sheets twisted and bunched as if someone had experienced a restless night. But examining the disturbance more closely, the pattern seemed wrong. The pillows were arranged as if two people had slept there, yet I remembered being alone. One pillow bore the clear impression of a head, while the other showed only the slightest indentation, as if someone had lain there briefly before rising. The dresser mirror reflected the room behind me, but something in the reflection caught my attention. A shadow that didn't correspond to any object I could see, a dark shape that seemed to hover near the window. When I turned to look directly, nothing was there, yet the mirror continued to show this anomalous darkness. I moved closer to the glass, studying my own reflection, searching for some explanation for the discrepancy. The jewelry box on the dresser sat open, its tiny ballerina frozen mid-pirouette. I never left it open. The music it played when wound was too melancholy for my taste. Yet here it was, revealing the small collection of earrings and necklaces within. One piece was missing a simple silver chain that I wore almost daily. Its absence created a small gap in the organized arrangement, like a missing tooth in an otherwise perfect smile. The bathroom faucet dripped with metronomic persistence, each drop striking the porcelain sink with a tiny ping. I was certain I had turned it off tightly the night before, as I did every night. The sound hadn't disturbed my sleep, yet now it seemed impossibly loud, each drop marking time like a countdown to something unknown. The basin showed water stains that suggested the dripping had continued for hours. The medicine cabinet mirror swung open at my touch, revealing the usual array of prescriptions and toiletries. But one bottle sat in the wrong position, moved from its customary spot on the middle shelf to the top shelf, well out of easy reach. The label faced inward, hiding its contents, though I knew it contained the sleep medication I rarely used. The safety cap lay beside it, removed, and several pills were missing from what had been a full bottle. The shower curtain hung at an unusual angle, as if someone had brushed against it recently. The plastic rings that held it to the rod were slightly askew, creating uneven folds in the fabric. Behind the curtain, the shower floor showed droplets of water despite my not having used it the previous evening. The droplets formed no clear pattern, scattered randomly as if someone had stood there briefly, long enough for condensation to form and fall. The towel rack held a damp towel that I didn't remember using. Its fabric was still slightly warm, suggesting recent use, yet the bathroom held no lingering steam or humidity that would indicate a recent shower. When I lifted the towel, I caught a faint scent that wasn't mine, something floral and light, like perfume that had been diluted by water and time. The hallway photographs seemed to watch me as I passed, their familiar faces suddenly appearing foreign and questioning. In one frame, a picture of me at a gathering I could barely remember, I noticed someone in the background whose face I couldn't quite make out. The figure stood partially obscured by shadow, but their posture suggested familiarity, as if they belonged in that space in that moment in my life. The telephone in the hallway showed a missed call on its display, the red light blinking steadily. The number wasn't one I recognized, though something about the area code seemed familiar. The timestamp indicated the call had come in during the early morning hours, long after any reasonable person would call. I hesitated before checking the voicemail, uncertain whether I wanted to hear the message that waited there. The kitchen window overlooked the back garden, where morning dew clung to the grass in perfect droplets. But there, crossing the lawn in a diagonal line, were footprints pressed into the soft earth. The prints were filling slowly with water, suggesting they were recent, made perhaps an hour before dawn. They led from the garden gate toward the house, stopping directly beneath the kitchen window where I now stood. The coffee maker sat unplugged on the counter, though I distinctly remembered setting the timer the night before. The clock face was blank, its numbers invisible against the dark display. The carafe was empty, but the warming plate showed water marks, circular stains that suggested it had held something recently. The coffee filters in the cabinet had been disturbed, several pulled from the stack and left scattered beside the machine. The breakfast table held two place settings, complete with plates, cups, and silverware arranged with careful precision. I stared at this domestic tableau, trying to remember preparing it, trying to recall expecting someone for breakfast. The second cup showed a faint ring of coffee residue at its bottom, evidence that it had been used despite my having no memory of serving anyone. The morning newspaper lay folded on the front porch, but when I retrieved it, I found it was yesterday's edition. Today's paper was nowhere to be found, though I could see the delivery truck making its rounds in the distance. The missing paper felt like a small theft, a disruption in the routine that governed my quiet mornings. The mailbox flag stood upright, indicating outgoing mail, though I couldn't remember placing anything there. Inside, I found an envelope addressed in handwriting I didn't recognize, though something about the loops and curves of the letters felt familiar. The return address was smudged, illegible, as if water had blurred the ink. The envelope was sealed, waiting for pickup, containing a message I had no memory of writing. The garden gate latch was undone, its metal tongue hanging loose despite my habit of securing it each evening. The hinges showed fresh scratches, as if the gate had been opened hastily or by someone unfamiliar with its tendency to stick. Beyond the gate, the alley was empty, but I could see tire tracks in the gravel, fresh impressions that hadn't been there the day before. The garbage can at the curb was lighter than it should have been, several bags missing from what I remembered placing there the night before. The remaining contents had been disturbed, rearranged as if someone had searched through them. A piece of paper protruded from beneath the lid, a receipt or document that I couldn't quite reach without moving the entire container. The neighbor's cat sat watching from across the street, its yellow eyes fixed on my house with unusual intensity. The animal was typically friendly, often approaching for attention, but today it maintained its distance, alert and wary. Its behavior struck me as significant, though I couldn't articulate why. Animals, I had always believed, possessed senses more acute than human perception. The return journey to my front door felt longer than it should have, each step measured and deliberate. The key turned easily in the lock, but the familiar click of the mechanism engaging sounded different somehow, more final than usual. As I stepped back inside, the house seemed to exhale around me, settling into itself with small creaks and sighs that I had never noticed before. The morning light had shifted during my brief excursion outside, casting new shadows across the familiar rooms. What had seemed clear and explicable in the dawn's early glow now appeared ambiguous, laden with possibilities I didn't want to consider. The evidence of disturbance that I had catalogued so carefully could be explained in multiple ways, each explanation carrying its own implications. The silence in the house felt different now, not empty but expectant, as if something waited just beyond the edge of perception. I found myself moving more quietly, unconsciously adapting to an atmosphere that had somehow become charged with uncertainty. Every familiar object seemed to hold secrets. Every surface bore traces of activities I couldn't quite remember or explain. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked with steady persistence, but when I looked at its face, I realized I had lost track of time entirely. The morning had passed without my awareness, consumed by this inventory of small mysteries that surrounded me. The hands pointed to an hour that seemed impossible, suggesting I had spent far longer examining these details than I could account for. The final element that drew my attention was the most subtle yet somehow the most unsettling. The air itself felt different, charged with an energy that raised the fine hairs on my arms. It carried scents that shouldn't have been there, traces of perfume, coffee, the lingering warmth of another person's presence. The atmosphere held echoes of conversations I couldn't remember having, of movements through rooms that should have been empty, of a night that had apparently contained far more activity than my memory could access. Story 5. I stood in the shadowed corner of the room, eyes fixed on the street outside, where nothing seemed to move as it should. The trees swayed slightly, but the leaves made no sound. A car was parked just beyond the curb, and though it had been there for hours, it felt newly out of place. The air seemed to hold its breath, waiting. The drapes beside me brushed gently against my arm without wind to stir them, a subtle reminder that something was off. A stray cat appeared in the alleyway, pausing as if sensing an unseen presence. And then, without a rustle, the cat quickly vanished from view, leaving only an unsettling silence in its wake. The fabric against my skin brings it all back, not the case itself, but the feeling of it. The weight of questions that multiplied like cells dividing, each answer spawning two more uncertainties. I press my palm against the window glass and wonder if she stood here too, watching the same street, feeling the same wrongness in the air. Her apartment had been like this one. Similar windows, similar view, or maybe I'm misremembering. The mind does that, doesn't it? Fills in gaps with familiar shapes, comfortable lies. The detective had asked me to walk through it again. Third time, maybe fourth. His pen scratched against the notepad in a rhythm that seemed too deliberate, like he was writing something else entirely. You said she called you that morning. Yes, no, she called the night before, I think. Which was it? I remember the sound of her voice more than the words, thin, stretched like wire about to snap. She'd been talking about the man downstairs, the one who collected newspapers. Stacks of them, she said, going back years. But when I asked the building manager later, he told me the unit below hers had been vacant for months. The car outside hasn't moved. Same position, same angle. The license plate catches afternoon light in a way that makes the numbers blur together. I've been watching it for 20 minutes now, or maybe 2 hours. Time moves strangely when you're trying to remember something that refuses to be remembered clearly. She'd shown me a photograph once, at least I think she did, a Polaroid faded at the edges, showing a group of people at what might have been a party. She pointed to a figure in the background, partially obscured by shadow. That's him, she'd said, the one who's been following me. But when I looked closer, the shadow seemed empty, just negative space between other bodies, a trick of light and composition. I told her this gently, and she'd taken the photo back with shaking hands. You don't see him because he doesn't want you to see him. The logic was airtight and completely wrong, the way paranoid thinking often is. Perfect internal consistency built on a foundation of sand. My reflection in the window looks tired, older than it should. The case aged me, though I was never officially part of it. Just a friend who answered phone calls at strange hours, who listened to theories that grew more elaborate with each telling. The newspapers bothered her most. She'd started collecting them too, trying to find patterns in the headlines, connections between seemingly unrelated stories. Her coffee table disappeared under layers of newsprint, and she'd trace her finger across columns of text like she was reading Braille. Look at this, she'd say, showing me articles about missing pets, construction delays, minor traffic accidents. It's all connected. He's sending me messages. I wanted to tell her that coincidence isn't conspiracy, that the human brain is designed to find patterns even where none exist. Instead, I'd nod and make non-committal sounds while she explained how a road closure 3 neighborhoods away was somehow related to her fear of the man who may or may not have lived downstairs. The detective's notes, when I finally saw them, were disappointingly brief. A few paragraphs summarizing what little they knew. No signs of forced entry, no evidence of foul play, personal effects undisturbed. The apartment had been neat, almost sterile, nothing like the chaotic paper fortress I remembered visiting. "Are you sure you have the right address?" I'd asked. He'd looked at me with the patient expression cops develop for dealing with civilians who ask inconvenient questions. "She was your friend, you tell me." But I couldn't, not with certainty. Memory is unreliable, especially when filtered through stress and grief. Had I really been to her apartment, or had I only imagined it based on her descriptions? The more I tried to recall specific details, the more they seemed to shift and blur. The cat reappears in the alley, or maybe it's a different cat. This one is darker, moves with more purpose. It approaches something I can't see from this angle, something hidden behind the dumpster. For a moment I consider going downstairs to look, then dismiss the impulse. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. Her phone calls had become increasingly frequent in those final weeks. She developed theories about the timing of garbage collection, the patterns of street cleaning, the way certain lights in neighboring buildings would flicker on and off. Everything was significant, nothing was random. "He's trying to drive me crazy," she'd whisper into the phone, making me doubt what I see, what I know. The irony was too painful to acknowledge directly. She was doing that to herself, constructing an elaborate prison of suspicion and fear. But saying so would have been cruel, and cruelty disguised as truth is still cruelty. I have a recording of one of our last conversations. Not intentionally, my phone had been acting up, starting and stopping the voice memo app without warning. When I discovered it later, I almost deleted it immediately. Her voice, captured in fragments, talking about patterns in the rain, messages hidden in the arrangement of parked cars. "You have to listen carefully," she says on the recording. "The truth is in the spaces between things, not in the things themselves." There's wisdom in madness sometimes, even when the madness is destructive. She was right about the spaces between things, just wrong about what filled them. The official report listed her as a missing person. No body, no crime scene, no clear indication of what had happened. She'd simply stopped being where she was expected to be. Her job called when she didn't show up for 3 consecutive days. The landlord found her apartment unlocked, empty except for furniture and a few basic possessions. No newspapers, no photographs, no evidence of the elaborate surveillance network she described to me in such vivid detail. "People don't just vanish," the detective had said, but his tone suggested otherwise. "People vanish all the time in ways both dramatic and mundane. Sometimes they're taken, sometimes they leave. Sometimes they simply stop existing in any meaningful sense, becoming ghosts of themselves long before they disappear entirely. The car outside starts its engine. I hadn't noticed anyone getting in, but now I can see a figure behind the wheel, features obscured by the angle and the tinted glass. It pulls away from the curb slowly, deliberately, and I find myself memorizing the license plate number even though I know I'll forget it within minutes. Some habits die hard. The case taught me to notice things, to catalog details that might prove significant later. It also taught me how quickly significance can drain away, leaving only the hollow shell of observation without meaning. I step away from the window, the drapes fall back into place, cutting off my view of the street. The room feels smaller now, more enclosed. I understand why she'd been drawn to windows, to the illusion of openness they provide. Walls press in when you're afraid, but glass offers the promise of escape, even when escape is impossible. Her sister contacted me a few months later. They'd found some of her things in a storage unit across town, the kind of place people use when they're planning to disappear or afraid someone else will make them disappear. Personal documents, old photographs, a journal filled with handwriting that grew increasingly erratic toward the end. "Did she ever mention this place to you?" the sister asked. I said no, which was true as far as I could remember, but memory is unreliable, and the case had taught me not to trust my own recollections completely. Maybe she had mentioned it, maybe I'd forgotten, or maybe I'd never really listened. The journal entries, what little the sister shared with me, painted a picture of someone trapped between reality and delusion, unable to distinguish between genuine threats and imagined ones. The handwriting deteriorated over time, becoming almost illegible in the final entries. One fragment stayed with me. The watcher has become the watched. The pattern is complete. I don't know what she meant by that, if anything. Paranoid thinking often sounds profound when taken out of context, like broken poetry or fragments of prophecy. But meaning and the appearance of meaning are different things entirely. The afternoon light is fading. Street lamps begin to flicker on, one by one, in what might be a pattern or might be simple automation. I catch myself looking for significance in the timing, in the sequence of illumination, and force myself to stop. This is how it starts, I think. This is how the watchers become the watched. The case never officially closed because there was never officially a case. Missing persons reports are filed and forgotten unless evidence of foul play emerges. She became a statistic, a name in a database, a file gathering dust in some bureaucratic limbo. But cases don't really close, not in the mind of someone who lived through them. They just recede, like tide pools exposed at low water, leaving behind strange shapes and unexplained debris. I still think about her sometimes, wonder if she found what she was looking for or if what she was looking for found her. Wonder if the man with the newspapers was real, if the patterns she saw had substance, if her fear was justified in ways I was too rational to understand. The truth is probably simpler and more tragic. Mental illness dressed up as mystery, isolation mistaken for persecution. But simple truths don't explain everything, and the spaces between certainties remain vast and dark. The phone rings. I let it go to voicemail, then check the message. Unknown number, no voice, just the sound of someone breathing quietly for 30 seconds before hanging up. Probably a wrong number, probably nothing. Probably. But I find myself moving away from the windows, drawing the curtains tighter, checking the locks on doors I know are already secure. The case taught me many things, but perhaps the most important lesson was this: paranoia is contagious, and once it takes hold, it's almost impossible to distinguish between reasonable caution and unreasonable fear. The room grows darker. Outside, the street settles into evening rhythms. Cars pass at irregular intervals, their headlights sweeping across my walls in patterns that mean nothing and everything, depending on how you choose to look at them. I close my eyes and try to remember her face clearly, but the image wavers like heat shimmer on summer asphalt. Memory fades, details blur, and eventually even the most vivid experiences become uncertain, questionable, possibly false. This is what remains, the feeling of wrongness, the weight of unanswered questions, the knowledge that some mysteries are designed not to be solved but to be lived with, carried like stones in deep pockets. The case is over, the case will never be over. Both things are true and neither explains the other. Story 6. The weight of ordinary things. I mentioned casually that nothing unusual happened. They seemed satisfied, scribbling away, maybe even relieved. The air felt heavy, as if clouds had settled low, stealing the light that should have warmed the morning. My hands still tingled, the peculiar sensation of paper cuts mingling with the scent of burnt coffee, bitter and acrid. In the corner, shadows stretched unnaturally, twisting across the carpet like dark tendrils. Dampness clung to my shoes, echoing the puddle that shouldn't have been there. The clock on the wall ticked with deliberate slowness, each movement a reminder, but my skin felt like a stranger's. The officers left with their notebooks full of my carefully chosen words. I watched through the window as they drove away, their brake lights disappearing into the gray morning. Only then did I notice the envelope on my kitchen counter, cream-colored and thick, my name written in handwriting I recognized but couldn't immediately place. Inside, a single photograph, black and white, slightly blurred at the edges, a woman sitting on a park bench feeding pigeons. She wore a coat I'd seen before, hanging in a closet that wasn't mine. The back of the photo bore a single word in pencil: remember. My neighbor had been missing for 3 days. I'd been the last person to see her alive, or so everyone believed. We'd shared coffee that morning, sitting at my kitchen table where the officers had just questioned me. She'd seemed distracted, kept glancing toward the window, her fingers drumming against the ceramic mug in a rhythm that matched nothing I could identify. When she left, she'd forgotten her scarf, a pale blue thing that now hung by my door like a ghost. The photograph shouldn't have existed. I'd never seen her feed pigeons. She was allergic to birds, broke out in hives whenever they came too close. She'd told me this herself, laughing about childhood trips to the zoo that ended in emergency room visits. I turned the photo over again. The pencil marks were fresh, the graphite still slightly smudged. Someone had written this recently. Someone who wanted me to remember something I was certain had never happened. The coffee shop where we'd met regularly sat 3 blocks away. The owner knew us both, always had our orders ready before we reached the counter. I walked there now, the photograph tucked inside my jacket pocket, its corners sharp against my ribs. The bell above the door chimed with the same tone it always had, but the sound felt different now, hollow and accusatory. The owner looked up from behind the register, his expression shifting from recognition to something else. Caution, perhaps, or fear. She came in after you left that morning, he said before I could ask. Seemed upset, kept checking her phone, muttering about photographs. What kind of photographs? He shrugged, wiping down the counter with movements that seemed too deliberate. Didn't say, but she bought a disposable camera. Haven't seen those in years. Had to dig around in the back to find one. A disposable camera, the kind that required developing, that left physical evidence of every shot taken. I'd watched her leave my house that morning, walk down the street toward the bus stop. She turned back once, waved, and disappeared around the corner. If she'd come here afterward, if she'd bought a camera, then someone else had seen her after I had. The relief should have been overwhelming. Instead, it felt like ice settling in my stomach. Did she say where she was going? The park said she had an appointment. He paused, the rag frozen in his hands. Strange thing, though, she asked me about you. Wanted to know how long we'd known each other, what you usually talked about when you came in. The photograph in my pocket seemed to grow heavier. Someone had developed that disposable camera. Someone had chosen that particular image to send to me. The woman feeding pigeons, doing something she couldn't do, wearing a coat that belonged to someone else. I walked to the park, following the route she would have taken. The bench from the photograph sat near the duck pond, weathered wood marked with initials and declarations of love carved by strangers. Pigeon droppings covered the armrest. The birds clustered nearby, pecking at crumbs left by morning joggers. A groundskeeper worked nearby, collecting trash with mechanical precision. When I approached, he looked up with tired eyes that had seen too much and remembered too little. "You're asking about the woman," he said before I spoke. "Police already came by, showed me her picture." "Did you see her?" "See her, I took the picture." "My breath caught, you took it." "She asked me to, said she needed proof of something, kept talking about how someone wouldn't believe her unless she had evidence." He leaned on his trash picker, studying my face. "You look familiar. She showed me a picture of you too." The world tilted slightly. "What kind of picture?" "You and her sitting in some kitchen. You were laughing about something. She said you wouldn't remember, that you never remembered the important things." I had no memory of posing for such a photograph. Our coffee meetings had been casual routine. We discussed whether neighborhood gossip, the rising cost of groceries, nothing worth documenting, nothing worth remembering. She seemed scared, the groundskeeper continued, kept looking over her shoulder like someone was following her. I told the police that, but they didn't seem interested, said they were focusing on the people closest to her. The people closest to her, I told the officers we were casual acquaintances, nothing more, but she'd carried my photograph, asked questions about me, sought proof of something I couldn't recall. The gap between what I remembered and what others had witnessed was growing wider with each conversation. That evening I sat in my kitchen, staring at the chair where she'd sat 3 mornings ago. The coffee mug she'd used still sat in my sink, unwashed. I'd meant to clean it but kept forgetting, as if some part of my mind wanted to preserve the evidence of her presence. The scarf by the door moved slightly in the breeze from the heating vent. I reached for it and the fabric felt wrong against my fingers. Too smooth, too expensive, not the kind of thing she would have worn. She favored practical clothes, items chosen for comfort rather than style. I examined the label, a designer name I recognized but couldn't afford. The kind of scarf that cost more than I spent on groceries in a month. Either I'd been wrong about her financial situation, or this scarf belonged to someone else entirely. My phone rang. The caller ID showed no number, just a string of zeros. "You found the photograph." The voice was electronically distorted, neither male nor female. "Who is this?" "Someone who knows you're lying." The line went dead. I checked every lock, drew every curtain, but the feeling of being watched persisted. Someone had been in my house. Someone had left the photograph, taken the scarf, arranged things to create doubt where certainty had existed. The next morning brought another envelope, this time a receipt from a restaurant I'd never visited, dated the evening before she disappeared. 2 meals, 2 drinks, the total circled in red ink. At the bottom, a handwritten note, "You always insisted on paying." I drove to the restaurant, a small place tucked between a laundromat and a used bookstore. The hostess recognized the receipt, remembered the evening. "You two seemed tense," she said, consulting her seating chart. "Kept your voices low, like you were arguing about something private. She left first, seemed upset. You stayed and finished your drink." What did I look like? She described someone who could have been me. Same height, same build, same color hair. But the details felt wrong, like a portrait painted by someone who'd only heard me described secondhand. "Do you have security cameras?" Broken for months, keep meaning to fix them. Of course they were broken. Every piece of potential evidence led to dead ends, carefully constructed to suggest without proving, to implicate without confirming. I spent the afternoon at the library, researching cases of false memories, identity theft, elaborate gaslighting schemes. The possibilities were endless and terrifying. Someone could be systematically constructing a false narrative, planting evidence, coaching witnesses, creating a version of reality that existed only in others' minds. But why? What had I done to deserve such elaborate attention? What had she done? The answer came in another envelope, slipped under my door while I slept. This time, a copy of a police report filed 2 years ago in another jurisdiction. A woman matching her description had accused someone matching mine of stalking, harassment, threats. The case had been dropped due to lack of evidence, but the report painted a picture of obsession and escalating behavior. The accused person's name was redacted, but the details were specific enough to be convincing. Same profession, same age, same physical description. Either an incredible coincidence, or someone had spent considerable time crafting a false identity that paralleled my real one. I called the police department that had filed the report. The detective who'd handled the case was retired, but his replacement agreed to meet with me off the record. We sat in a diner that smelled of grease and disappointment, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like trapped insects. The detective was younger than I'd expected, with eyes that had already seen too much. "The woman who filed that report," he said, sliding a folder across the table. "She recanted everything a week later, said she'd made it all up, that she was having some kind of breakdown. We closed the case, but something about it never sat right." "What do you mean?" "She seemed genuinely terrified when she filed the report. People don't usually fake that kind of fear, but when she came back to recant, she was different, calmer, like someone had convinced her she'd imagined everything." The folder contained photographs of the alleged stalking victim. It was her. Same face, same nervous smile, same way of holding her shoulders slightly raised as if bracing for impact. "The man she accused," I said, "do you have a picture?" "That's the strange part, we never got a clear description. She kept saying he looked like someone she knew but couldn't place, like a face from a dream." I drove home through streets that seemed unfamiliar despite decades of navigation. Every turn felt wrong, every landmark shifted slightly from where memory insisted it should be. The photograph of the pigeon-feeding woman sat on my passenger seat, and I found myself glancing at it repeatedly, searching for details I might have missed. At home, I discovered my computer had been accessed. The browser history showed searches I hadn't made, how to fake amnesia, creating false alibis, disposing of evidence. Someone wanted it to appear that I was researching methods of covering up a crime. But which crime, her disappearance, or something else entirely? The phone rang again, the same electronic voice, the same untraceable number. "You're starting to remember, aren't you?" "Remember what?" "What you did to her, what you've done before." "I haven't done anything." "The restaurant, the park, the camera. You were there for all of it, watching, planning. She knew. That's why she was documenting everything." "You're lying." "Am I?" "Check your coat pocket, the one hanging by the door." I found a roll of film, undeveloped, tucked deep in the pocket of a jacket I rarely wore. 24 exposures, all used. The weight of it felt significant, like evidence of crimes I couldn't remember committing. The photo lab was a relic from another era, staffed by an elderly man who remembered when film was the only option. He handled the roll with practiced efficiency, promising the prints would be ready within the hour. I waited in my car, watching pedestrians pass by with their ordinary problems and uncomplicated lives. A mother pushed a stroller, stopping to point out interesting things to her child. A businessman checked his phone while walking, oblivious to everything around him. Normal people living normal lives, untouched by the growing certainty that reality was more fragile than anyone wanted to believe. The photographs were ready exactly when promised. 24 images of her, taken over what appeared to be several weeks. Her leaving the coffee shop, walking through the park, entering her apartment building. The angles were careful, the focus sharp. The work of someone who had spent considerable time learning her routines. The final photograph showed her sitting in my kitchen, the same morning she disappeared. But in this image, she wasn't smiling or relaxed. She looked terrified, her eyes wide, her mouth open as if she were screaming. I had no memory of taking any of these pictures. The photo lab owner watched me examine the prints with professional detachment. When I asked if he remembered who had brought the film in, he shook his head. Dropped it in the night deposit box. Happens all the time. People want their privacy. But someone had wanted me to find these photographs. Someone had planted the film in my jacket, knowing I would eventually discover it, knowing it would lead me here. The electronic voice called again as I sat in the parking lot, staring at evidence of crimes I couldn't remember. Now you understand. Understand what? You've been doing this for years, different women, different places. You follow them, photograph them, make them disappear when they get too close to the truth. That's impossible. Is it? How much of your life do you actually remember? How many gaps have you filled in with convenient assumptions? The question hit like a physical blow. How much did I remember? The coffee meetings with her seemed real, but the details were hazy. I could recall the general shape of our conversations, but not the specific words. The morning she disappeared felt authentic, but the more I examined it, the more it resembled a performance I'd rehearsed rather than an experience I'd lived. She figured it out, the voice continued. Started documenting everything, gathering evidence. She was going to expose you. Then where is she? You tell me. The line went dead, leaving me alone with 24 photographs and the growing suspicion that my own mind was my worst enemy. I drove home through streets that felt increasingly foreign, past houses where strangers lived lives I couldn't fathom. The photographs sat on the seat beside me like accusations waiting to be voiced. At home, I searched every room, every closet, every drawer, looking for what I wasn't certain, evidence of guilt or evidence of innocence, some proof that I was either a monster or a victim, but not something caught between the two. In the basement, behind a stack of boxes I'd forgotten I owned, I found a journal. My handwriting, but words I didn't remember writing. Entries spanning months, describing surveillance techniques, behavioral patterns, methods of approach. Clinical observations about women who fit a specific profile, lonely, trusting, eager for connection. Her name appeared frequently in the later entries. Notes about her schedule, her preferences, her vulnerabilities. Plans for gaining her trust, isolating her from potential support systems, creating dependency. The final entry was dated the morning she disappeared. She knows, time to implement final protocol. I had no memory of writing any of it. The basement felt colder now, shadows deeper. I examined every corner looking for signs of recent disturbance. In the far corner, behind the water heater, the concrete floor showed signs of recent repair. A patch of cement slightly different in color, as if something had been buried and covered. My hands shook as I found a hammer, a chisel. The cement was thin, hastily applied. It broke away easily, revealing disturbed earth beneath. I dug carefully, methodically, each shovelful of dirt bringing me closer to a truth I was terrified to discover. The soil was loose, recently turned. Something had been buried here, something significant enough to require concealment. My shovel struck something soft, fabric. I brushed away the dirt with trembling fingers, revealing the pale blue scarf she'd left at my house. But beneath the scarf, nothing. No body, no evidence of violence, just an empty hole and a piece of cloth that should have been hanging by my door. Someone had wanted me to find this. Someone had planted the journal, buried the scarf, created a trail of evidence that led to this moment of horrible uncertainty. But why stop short of providing an actual body? What was the point of suggesting murder without proving it? The answer came as I climbed out of the basement, dirty and shaking. She was sitting at my kitchen table, alive and unharmed, wearing the expensive coat from the photograph. "Hello," she said calmly. "We need to talk." "You're supposed to be missing." "I am missing, just not in the way everyone thinks." She looked different somehow, more confident, less nervous. The frightened woman who'd sat in this same chair 3 days ago had been replaced by someone who seemed entirely in control. "I've been watching you discover the evidence," she continued. "Watching you question your own memories, your own sanity. It's fascinating how quickly someone can be made to doubt everything they know about themselves. You planted everything, the photographs, the journal, the scarf. Most of it, though you did take some of those pictures yourself, you just don't remember." "That's impossible." "Is it? You've been taking medication for sleep disorders, haven't you? The kind that can cause memory gaps, blackouts, the kind that makes someone highly susceptible to suggestion." I thought of the pills in my bathroom cabinet, prescribed after months of insomnia. The doctor had warned about potential side effects, confusion, memory loss, episodes of automatic behavior with no conscious recall. "You drugged me." "I enhanced what was already happening, guided your unconscious actions, created scenarios you would experience but not remember. It's surprisingly easy when someone trusts you." "Why?" "Because 2 years ago you destroyed my life. You stalked me, harassed me, made me afraid to leave my house. When I reported you, you convinced everyone I was crazy, made me doubt my own experiences until I recanted everything." The police report, the woman who'd filed charges and then withdrawn them, it had been her all along. "So you decided to return the favor." "I decided to show you what it feels like to have your reality questioned by everyone around you, to be told that your memories are false, your fears imaginary." "But I don't remember stalking you. I don't remember any of it." "Of course you don't. That's the beauty of it. You've become so good at forgetting your own crimes that you genuinely believe you're innocent." She stood, smoothing down the expensive coat that had never belonged to her. "The police will find the evidence eventually. The photographs, the journal, the disturbed ground in your basement. They'll piece together a story of escalating obsession and probable murder. The fact that my body is never found will only make it more mysterious, more compelling." "Where will you go?" "Somewhere you'll never find me, with a new name, a new life, far away from men who think women exist for their entertainment." She walked toward the door, pausing to straighten the empty scarf hook. "The interesting thing about gaslighting," she said, "is that it works both ways. By the time this is over, you won't know what's real and what isn't. You'll spend the rest of your life wondering if you're a victim or a monster." "Oh, wait." But she was already gone, disappearing into the morning like smoke dissipating in wind. I sat alone in my kitchen, surrounded by evidence of crimes I might or might not have committed, memories I couldn't trust, and the growing certainty that truth was more complicated than innocence or guilt. The officers would return eventually. They would find the journal, the photographs, the disturbed basement floor. They would construct a narrative that made sense of the evidence, regardless of whether that narrative reflected reality. And I would sit in interrogation rooms, trying to explain gaps in my memory to people who had already decided what those gaps contained. The phone rang one final time. No electronic distortion now, just her voice, clear and calm. "Do you remember now?" I closed my eyes, searching through fragments of memory that might have been dreams, dreams that might have been memories. "I don't know. That's the most honest thing you've said yet." The line went dead, leaving me alone with questions that had no answers and answers I was afraid to believe. Outside, clouds gathered like accusations waiting to be spoken. The morning light faded, replaced by shadows that seemed to move independently of their sources. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the empty chair across from me, wondering if anything I remembered could be trusted, wondering if the difference between victim and perpetrator was as clear as I'd always believed. The truth, whatever it was, felt as distant and unreachable as justice itself. Story 7. I was standing motionless in the corner of the room, my eyes fixed on the door that hung slightly ajar. The light from the adjacent room spilled across the threshold, distorting shadows that seemed to breathe against the walls. An uneasy rhythm pulsed in the air, a faint rustling that never settled into silence. The floor beneath me creaked intermittently, as if acknowledging a presence that wasn't visible. My senses strained, waiting for a sign that was never overt, but naggingly present. Every instinct told me to move, to act, but the door remained steadfast in its defiance. Then, a draft and imperceptible shift in the air whispered through the narrow gap, revealing the absence of something unmistakably familiar. The scent, that's what was missing, the faint trace of vanilla and cigarettes that always lingered in her apartment, even after she claimed to have quit smoking. I pressed my palm against the door frame, the wood cool and slightly damp under my fingertips. The absence felt heavier than any presence could have been. I remember the first time I noticed her hands. We were sitting across from each other in that coffee shop downtown, the one with the mismatched chairs and the barista who hummed off-key melodies. Her fingers wrapped around the ceramic mug, delicate but with calluses along the knuckles. Working hands, she called them. I asked what kind of work, and she smiled that half-smile that never quite reached her eyes. "The kind that keeps you awake at night," she said. I thought she was being dramatic. People always are when they want to seem mysterious. But now, standing in her empty apartment, I wonder if she was simply telling the truth. The police report sits folded in my jacket pocket. I've read it so many times the creases have worn thin, threatening to tear along the words that matter most. No signs of struggle, personal belongings undisturbed, subject appears to have left voluntarily. Voluntarily, as if disappearing was a choice she made over breakfast, casual as deciding between toast and cereal. But I knew her routines, the way she arranged her books by color rather than author, how she kept exactly 3 spare keys in the ceramic bowl by the door, one for her sister, one for the building superintendent, one for emergencies. The bowl is still there, but it holds only 2 keys now. The emergency key is gone. I step away from the door frame, my footsteps muffled by the carpet that's seen better decades. The living room feels suspended in time, waiting. Her coffee mug sits on the side table, a brown ring staining the wood beneath it. The coffee is long gone, evaporated into nothing, but the stain remains, evidence of a morning that started like any other. She was acting strange lately, her neighbor told the detective. I wasn't supposed to hear that conversation, but sound carries strangely in old buildings. Kept odd hours. I'd hear her moving around at all times of night. Strange, as if strangeness was a crime worth investigating. As if any of us aren't strange when examined closely enough. I found her journal wedged between the mattress and box spring. Not hidden exactly, but not displayed either. The entries are sporadic, written in that careful handwriting teachers always praised. Most of it is mundane grocery lists, appointment reminders, fragments of dreams she wanted to remember, but scattered throughout are other things, observations. The man in 4B watches from his window every Tuesday when I leave for work. Someone moved my mailbox key. It was hanging on the hook by the door, now it's in the kitchen drawer. Called the phone company. They say there's no record of service interruption, but I know the line was dead for 3 hours last Thursday. Paranoia, the detective called it when I showed him the journal. People see patterns that aren't there, he explained, especially when they're under stress. But what if the patterns were real? What if she wasn't imagining the watchers and the moved objects and the dead phone lines? The bathroom mirror is cracked. A spider web of fractures spreads from a central impact point about shoulder height. I touch the glass and my reflection splinters into fragments. In one piece I see my eye, in another just the corner of my mouth. The rest is empty space where my face should be. She never mentioned the broken mirror. In a journal full of suspicious details, she never wrote about the most obvious sign of disturbance in her apartment. I think about that often now, the things we notice and the things we overlook, the stories we tell ourselves to make sense of chaos. Her sister called me 3 weeks after the disappearance. I could hear traffic in the background, the distant hum of a city that keeps moving regardless of who goes missing. "Did she ever talk to you about our father?" she asked. I told her no, which was true. We talked about many things, but family wasn't one of them. Some subjects felt off limits, marked by invisible boundaries neither of us chose to cross. "He used to disappear," her sister continued. "Not for long, a day here, a weekend there. He'd come back like nothing happened, but something had changed, like he'd been somewhere we couldn't follow." The line went quiet except for the traffic sounds. I waited. I used to think it was another woman, or gambling, something normal people do when they're trying to escape their lives, but now I wonder if it was something else, something that runs in families. Something that runs in families, as if disappearing was a genetic trait passed down like eye color or the tendency toward bad knees. I found a receipt in her jacket pocket. Gas station, dated 2 days before anyone realized she was gone. The station is 40 miles outside the city, in a direction she had no reason to travel. I drove there once, parked where she might have parked, tried to see what she might have seen. Just another gas station, fluorescent lights and lottery tickets and coffee that tastes like it was brewed in a previous decade. The clerk didn't remember her, but that means nothing. People forget faces as quickly as they see them. But on the counter, someone had left a road atlas open to a page showing the interstate system. Red ink marked a route heading west, a line that started near our city and stretched toward places I'd never heard of. The clerk said it had been there for weeks. Customers sometimes looked at it, traced the red line with their fingers, then left without buying anything. I asked if I could take a photo, but he said the atlas belonged to someone else. Someone who came in regularly but never bought gas, just used the restroom and checked the map. A woman, he thought, though he couldn't be sure. People looked different under fluorescent lights. That night I dreamed about highways that led to nowhere. In the dream, I was driving but couldn't see the road ahead. The headlights illuminated only empty space, as if the asphalt simply ended where the light touched it. I kept driving anyway, trusting that the road would appear as I needed it. When I woke, I understood something I couldn't articulate, a feeling rather than a thought, the certainty that some journeys don't have destinations, only directions. Her bank account showed no unusual activity. No large withdrawals, no purchases that suggested preparation for travel. Her credit cards remain unused. It's as if she stepped out of the financial system entirely, became someone who exists without leaving electronic traces. The detective assigned to her case has kind eyes and tired shoulders. He's worked missing persons for 15 years, he told me, and the cases fall into patterns. Family disputes, mental health crises, people who plan their departures carefully, and people who decide in an instant that they can't spend another day being themselves. Which kind was she? I asked. He studied me for a long moment, as if deciding how much truth I could handle. The kind that makes you wonder if they were ever really here at all. I've started visiting places we went together, the coffee shop with the humming barista, the bookstore where she always browsed the travel section but never bought anything, the park where we sat on a bench and watched people walk their dogs. In each place I look for signs that we were there, proof that those conversations happened, that she existed outside my memory. But evidence fades. The barista doesn't remember us. The bookstore has rearranged its shelves. The bench in the park has been repainted. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined her entirely, if loneliness can create people so vivid they seem real until they're gone. But then I remember her laugh, the way it started quietly and built into something that made strangers turn and smile. You can't imagine a sound like that. It has to come from somewhere real. I found a business card in her desk drawer. Plain white, no logo, just a phone number printed in simple black font. I called it once. The line rang twice, then connected to a recording. You've reached a number that is no longer in service. If you believe you have reached this recording in error, please hang up and try your call again. I hung up and tried again, same recording, but something about the voice bothered me. Too smooth, too perfect, like it was generated rather than spoken. I called from different phones at different times of day, always the same recording. But once, just before the message began, I heard something else. A sound like wind through empty spaces, or maybe breathing. Her medical records show nothing unusual. No prescriptions that might explain sudden behavior changes. No appointments with psychiatrists or specialists. She was, according to every official document, perfectly ordinary, healthy, stable. But I remember the night she called me at 2 a.m. Her voice was different, smaller somehow, as if she was speaking from a great distance. "Do you ever feel like you're living someone else's life?" she asked. I told her everyone feels that way sometimes. It's part of being human, the disconnect between who we are and who we think we should be. "No," she said, "I mean literally. Like you woke up one day in the wrong body, in the wrong apartment, with the wrong memories." I asked if she was okay, if she needed me to come over, but she'd already hung up. The next time I saw her, she acted like the conversation never happened, smiled that half smile and asked if I wanted to get coffee. I didn't bring up the phone call. Maybe I should have. I've been having strange dreams lately, not about her exactly, but about empty spaces where people used to be. Rooms with indentations in the carpet where furniture once stood. Photographs with faces that have somehow faded, leaving only backgrounds and empty clothes. In one dream, I'm looking through a photo album, but every picture shows the same thing. Places where someone should be standing but isn't. Parks with single shadows cast by invisible bodies. Restaurant tables set for two with only one person visible. Cars with passenger doors open to empty seats. I wake from these dreams with the feeling that I've forgotten something important. A name or a face or a promise I made but can't remember. The feeling follows me through the day, a weight I carry without understanding why. Her apartment building has been sold. New owners, new management, new tenants moving into spaces that still hold the impressions of previous lives. I watched from across the street as they carried her belongings to a truck, boxes labeled with words like kitchen and bedroom, as if her existence could be sorted and categorized so simply. I wanted to stop them, to explain that those objects meant something. that the coffee-stained mug and the color-coded books and the cracked mirror were evidence of a person who mattered, but evidence of what and to whom? The new tenant in her apartment is a college student who complains about the drafts and the way sounds carry through the walls. She's already painted over the careful color scheme, replaced the mismatched furniture with items from discount stores. The transformation is efficient and complete. But sometimes, walking past the building at night, I see a light in what used to be her window. Not the harsh fluorescent bulb the student installed, but something softer, warmer, the kind of light that suggests someone is home, waiting. I know it's impossible. I know the student lives there now, with her textbooks and her loud music and her friends who visit at all hours. But knowledge and certainty aren't the same thing. The detective closed her case last month, not solved, closed. There's a difference, he explained. Solved means answers. Closed means they've run out of places to look. People disappear, he said, not unkindly. It's something humans do. We've been doing it since we learned to walk upright. The reasons don't always make sense to the people left behind. I asked if he thought she was still alive. He was quiet for a long time, shuffling papers that didn't need shuffling. I think she's wherever she needs to be, he said finally. It wasn't an answer, but it was something. I still carry the folded police report in my jacket pocket. The paper has grown soft from handling, the words blurred in places where my fingers have traced them repeatedly. No signs of struggle, personal belongings undisturbed, subject appears to have left voluntarily. But tonight, standing in this corner, watching shadows breathe against walls that remember her presence, I understand something different. Maybe the signs of struggle weren't physical. Maybe they were written in cracked mirrors and moved keys and phone calls at 2 a.m. Maybe she fought something we couldn't see, something that doesn't leave fingerprints or DNA evidence. The draft whispers through the gap again, carrying nothing and everything. I close my eyes and try to remember her face, but memory is unreliable. Features blur and shift. What remains is the impression of her, the space she occupied, the way air moved differently when she was in a room. I think I understand now why she kept that emergency key separate from the others. Not for getting in, but for getting out. For those moments when staying becomes impossible and leaving is the only choice that makes sense. The door hangs slightly ajar, patient and waiting. Beyond it, light spills across a threshold I've never crossed. I could push it open, step through, follow whatever path she found. Or I could turn away, carry her absence like a question that doesn't need answering. The floor creaks beneath my feet as I shift my weight. The sound echoes in the space between certainty and doubt, between what happened and what I'll never know. In the end, maybe that's enough. Maybe some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, only lived with. Maybe the most honest thing I can do is stand here in this corner, watching shadows breathe, and accept that some people are meant to disappear. The absence of vanilla and cigarettes fills the air like a presence all its own. Story 8. The weight of evidence asterisk. It wasn't the first time the office was dark when I arrived. The blinds always seemed slightly ajar, letting in just a sliver of morning light. Papers were ever so slightly rearranged, not enough to raise suspicion, but noticeable if you looked. I walked past the file cabinet, its drawers never quite shut, as if someone had gone through them in haste. The coffee pot was cold, yet it still had remnants from the previous day. I noticed the calendar was a page behind. When I left that evening, I didn't bother to lock the door. I assumed it would be easier if things remained as they were. The case file sat on my desk exactly where I had placed it. The manila folder bore no special markings, just a number sequence that had become as familiar as my own reflection. Inside were photographs that had lost their glossy finish from being handled too often. Each image told a story that refused to make complete sense, no matter how many times I studied them. The victim had been found in her own home, a modest two-story house with peeling paint and a garden that suggested someone who cared about appearances. She was discovered by her neighbor, a woman who insisted something felt wrong when the morning newspaper remained untouched on the front step. The neighbor had called out, knocked, then used the spare key hidden beneath a ceramic frog by the door. What struck me most about the scene wasn't what was there, but what wasn't. No signs of forced entry, no evidence of a struggle. The victim lay peacefully on her living room sofa as if she had simply fallen asleep while reading. The book was still open in her lap, a romance novel with a bookmark placed precisely at chapter 12. Her reading glasses rested on the coffee table beside a cup of tea that had grown cold. The medical examiner's report provided more questions than answers. No obvious cause of death, no trauma, no signs of poisoning in the preliminary tests. The woman appeared to have simply stopped living, as if someone had turned off a switch. But people don't just die like that, not healthy people in their 50s with no known medical conditions. I had been assigned the case because of my reputation for persistence. Others might have closed it quickly, filed it under natural causes, moved on to cases with clearer motives and suspects. But something about the pristine nature of the scene bothered me. It was too perfect, too undisturbed. Real death is messy, even when it appears peaceful. The victim's name was written in my notes, but I found myself thinking of her simply as the woman. She had worked as a librarian for over 20 years, lived alone since her divorce, maintained a small circle of friends who described her as reliable and kind. Her ex-husband had moved across the country, had an alibi, and seemed genuinely shocked by the news. Her adult children lived far away and hadn't spoken to her in months, a fact that seemed to weigh heavily on everyone involved. I spent days interviewing neighbors, friends, coworkers. Each conversation added another layer to the mystery without providing clarity. The woman had seemed normal in the days leading up to her death. She had attended her book club meeting, gone grocery shopping, even made plans to visit her sister the following weekend. Nothing suggested someone preparing to die or someone in fear for their life. The breakthrough came when I decided to examine her personal belongings more carefully. In her bedroom dresser, tucked between folded sweaters, I found a small digital recorder. The device was old, the kind used for recording lectures or interviews. When I pressed play, her voice filled the room, clear and measured. She had been documenting something. The recordings were dated, starting several months before her death. At first, they seemed mundane, almost like diary entries. She talked about her daily routine, her concerns about aging, her regrets about relationships that had ended badly. But as I listened to more recordings, a pattern emerged. She had been receiving visitors, always late in the evening, always unexpected. Someone would knock on her door and she would let them in without question. The recordings captured fragments of these encounters, muffled voices, the sound of footsteps on hardwood floors, the clink of glasses being set down. In one recording, I could hear her speaking to someone, though the other person's responses were too quiet to understand. She sounded nervous, choosing her words carefully. She mentioned something about keeping secrets, about promises made long ago. There was a tension in her voice I hadn't expected, a fear that contradicted everything her friends had told me about her peaceful final days. The last recording was different. Her voice was barely above a whisper, as if she were hiding while speaking. She talked about feeling watched, about noticing her things had been moved. She mentioned the same details I had observed in my own office, the subtle signs that someone had been searching through personal spaces. She suspected someone had been entering her house when she wasn't home. But then her voice changed, became resigned, almost relieved. She spoke about being tired of running, tired of looking over her shoulder. She mentioned a name just once, so quietly I had to replay the section multiple times to be certain I had heard correctly. It was someone she had trusted, someone who had been part of her life for years. I cross-referenced the name with her address book, her phone records, the list of people who had attended her funeral. The connection was there, hidden in plain sight. A friend from her book club, someone who had spoken at the service about what a wonderful person the victim had been. someone who had access to her house, her routines, her trust. When I interviewed this person again, I watched their body language more carefully. They fidgeted with their hands, avoided direct eye contact when discussing the victim's final days. They mentioned details about the crime scene that hadn't been released to the public, small things that could have been overlooked as assumptions or lucky guesses. The evidence was circumstantial, the kind that creates doubt rather than certainty. There were no fingerprints where they shouldn't be, no DNA evidence, no witnesses to anything more suspicious than friendly visits. But the pattern was there, visible once I knew how to look for it. The victim had discovered something about her friend, something worth killing for, and had been slowly documenting her growing fear and suspicion. The method remained unclear. How do you kill someone without leaving traces of violence or poison? How do you make murder look like natural death so convincingly that even trained professionals accept it without question? The answer might lie in medical knowledge, access to substances that don't show up in standard toxicology screens, or techniques that mimic natural cardiac events. I brought my suspicions to my supervisor, presented the evidence I had gathered, played the recordings that seemed to point toward a specific suspect. The response was predictably cautious. Suspicion isn't proof. Recordings can be misinterpreted. Circumstantial evidence rarely survives the scrutiny of a courtroom, especially when it involves respected members of the community. The case officially remains open but inactive. The suspect continues to live their life, attends the same book club meetings, maintains the same social connections that provided access to the victim. Sometimes I drive past their house, wondering what secrets hide behind those ordinary windows, what conversations take place in that living room that looks so similar to the one where the victim was found. I've started keeping my own recordings, documenting the small inconsistencies I notice in my daily life. Papers moved slightly, coffee pots that shouldn't be warm, calendars that fall behind. The paranoia might be getting to me, or maybe I'm finally learning to see what was always there. The truth about the case feels like something I can almost touch but never quite grasp. Each piece of evidence leads to more questions, each answer reveals new mysteries. The victim trusted someone who betrayed that trust in the most final way possible. The method was so sophisticated, so subtle, that it might never be proven in court. Justice, I've learned, doesn't always come through legal channels. Sometimes it exists in the knowledge that someone knows that the truth has been uncovered even if it can't be acted upon. The suspect knows I suspect them. Our interactions have changed, become more careful, more watched. They understand that their perfect crime wasn't quite perfect enough. The recording device sits in my desk drawer now, evidence in a case that may never see trial. Sometimes I take it out and listen to the victim's voice again, searching for clues I might have missed, details that could provide the definitive proof needed for justice. Her fear was real, her suspicions accurate, her death preventable if only someone had listened sooner. Late at night, when my office is dark and the building empty, I wonder if I'm next. If discovering the truth about one perfect murder makes me a threat worth eliminating. The victim thought she was documenting evidence that would protect her, but instead she was creating a record of her own doom. The case file remains open on my desk, a reminder that some crimes exist in the space between knowing and proving, between suspicion and certainty. The killer walks free, protected by the very perfection of their crime, and I sit in my office checking locks, noting which papers have been moved, wondering if paranoia is just another word for survival. Story 9. It sounded like pages being turned, the rhythmic rustle echoing faintly from a corner of the room. I stood transfixed, my fingers brushing the edge of a dusty bookshelf. The sound seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere, leaving a chill beneath my skin. Each rustle was slow, deliberate, as if someone unseen was reading a forgotten story aloud. I crossed the room, drawn to the source, though the air felt heavier with each step. The far wall held nothing but a tapestry, colors faded into obscurity. Yet the sound persisted, bypassing the fabric, reaching into a place I couldn't quite grasp. A half-forgotten memory stirred, anchoring me to a moment I wasn't sure was mine. I hadn't encountered that sound since the room was filled with voices. The coffee was still warm when I found the note, not addressed to me, but folded beneath the cup like a coaster. My handwriting, though I couldn't recall forming those particular words. She knows about the room upstairs. The ink was fresh, still slightly wet at the corners. I set the cup down carefully, watching steam curl between my fingers. Sometimes I catch myself listening for footsteps that never come. The house settles in predictable ways, a creak near the kitchen window, the soft groan of floorboards adjusting to temperature changes. But there are other sounds, ones that don't belong to wood or foundation. Light steps that pause outside doors as if someone is deciding whether to enter. The real estate agent had mentioned the previous owner briefly. A woman who lived alone, kept to herself. She'd left suddenly, the agent said, without taking much. Personal items remained scattered throughout the house, books with pages dog-eared, half-finished crossword puzzles, a coffee mug with lipstick stains still visible on the rim. I found the first photograph tucked between pages of a cookbook I'd never opened. A woman standing in what appeared to be this very kitchen, though the lighting was different, softer somehow. She was looking directly at the camera, but her expression was unreadable. Not quite smiling, not quite serious. Behind her, barely visible, was a door I didn't recognize. The sound of pages turning has become more frequent. It happens mostly in the evening when shadows stretch across the hardwood floors. I've searched every room, opened every book, but the source remains elusive. Sometimes I wonder if I'm the one turning pages unconsciously, while my mind wanders to places I can't quite name. There was a day when I found all the books rearranged, not dramatically, just subtle shifts that made the shelves look unfamiliar. A cookbook moved from the kitchen to the living room. A mystery novel placed spine inward on a bedroom shelf. Small changes that suggested someone had been reading, reorganizing, making themselves at home. The woman in the photograph looks familiar now, though I can't place where I might have seen her. Her face has a quality that makes me think of mirrors, not because we resemble each other, but because looking at her feels like looking at something reflected, distorted by angles I can't understand. I've started leaving my own notes, simple observations written on scraps of paper and left in various rooms. Kitchen light flickers at dusk. Bedroom door opens slightly overnight. Sound of running water when all faucets are closed. When I return to collect them, some are missing. Others have additional lines written in handwriting that might be mine, though I don't remember adding them. The tapestry on the far wall depicts a scene I can almost recognize. Figures gathered around a table, their faces obscured by shadow or artistic choice. One figure stands apart, hand raised as if in greeting or warning. The threads are so faded that details emerge and disappear depending on the light, creating an image that seems to shift when I'm not looking directly at it. Last week I discovered a door behind the tapestry, not hidden exactly, but camouflaged by the way the fabric hangs. The door is unlocked, but I haven't opened it yet. Something about the brass handle, worn smooth by countless touches, makes me hesitate. The sound of pages turning is strongest near this door. I've been thinking about the previous owner's departure. The agent described it as sudden, but what if it wasn't? What if she's still here, in ways that don't require physical presence? Her books, her notes, her habits embedded so deeply in the house's rhythm that they continue without her. The photographs have multiplied. I find them everywhere now, slipped between magazines, taped to the inside of cabinet doors, pressed between window panes and their frames. All show the same woman, but in different rooms, different seasons of light. In some, she appears to be looking directly at me. There are conversations I remember having but can't place in time or space. Discussions about loneliness, about the way empty houses fill themselves with echoes of previous lives. A voice that might have been hers or mine, or something created by the intersection of memory and wishful thinking. The notes I find now are longer, more detailed. They describe routines I don't remember establishing, observations about neighbors I've never met, plans for renovations in rooms that don't exist. The handwriting grows more confident with each discovery, as if the writer is becoming more certain of their place in this house. I opened the door behind the tapestry this morning. The room beyond is small, filled with natural light from a window I can't see from outside the house. A reading chair sits positioned to catch the afternoon sun, and beside it, a small table stacked with books. All the missing books from downstairs, arranged in careful piles. The sound of pages turning comes from this room, I'm certain now. But when I sit in the chair and listen, the sound seems to move, echoing from the main part of the house, as if the act of finding the source has displaced it somewhere else. In the hidden room, I found a journal filled with entries that span months, maybe years. The handwriting changes gradually throughout, starting with careful script and evolving into something more hurried, more familiar. The entries describe daily life in this house, my daily life, though I don't remember living most of these moments. The last entry is dated today. It describes finding a hidden room, sitting in a reading chair, discovering a journal. It ends mid-sentence, the pen still resting on the open page, ink barely dry. I can hear the sound of pages turning from downstairs now, rhythmic and patient, as if someone has finally found the story they were looking for, story 10. My hand had just left the smooth railing, the oily warmth lingering on my palm. The air felt dense, pressing against my skin like a silent watch. As I exhaled, the subtle scent of stale coffee and damp wool filled my senses, telling stories of the unseen. My pulse quickened, though the hallway remained empty, framed by shadows that seemed too eager to hide. I blinked, and the echoes shifted, a murmur of something misplaced. The ferry's gentle rocking had become part of my breathing by then. I'd been crossing these waters for months, watching the same passengers board with their newspapers and thermoses, their quiet conversations dissolving into the hum of engines. But that morning was different, not in any way I could name at first, just a subtle wrongness that clung to the air like fog. I remember thinking about trust, how it accumulates in small deposits, like coins in a jar you never count until it's gone. The captain had been making these crossings longer than anyone could recall, his weathered hands steady on the wheel, his voice crackling over the intercom with the same reassuring announcements. We all trusted him without question, the way you trust gravity or the tide. But trust, I've learned, is just another word for not paying attention. The woman in the blue coat had been riding the ferry for weeks before I noticed her. She always sat in the same spot near the port windows, her fingers tracing patterns on the glass while she watched the water. Sometimes she would pull out a small notebook and write something, then close it quickly, as if the words might escape. I found myself studying her reflection in the opposite windows, trying to read the expression she wore when she thought no one was looking. There's something hypnotic about watching someone who doesn't know they're being watched. The way they let their face relax into its natural shape, the unconscious gestures that reveal more than any conversation. She had a habit of touching her throat when she was thinking, just a brief brush of fingertips against skin, like she was checking for something that should have been there. I started bringing my coffee to the same section of the ferry, positioning myself where I could observe her without seeming to. It wasn't romantic interest at least, I don't think it was. It was something deeper than that, more troubling. A recognition that pulled at something buried in my chest, the way certain songs can transport you to places you'd forgotten you'd been. The notebook bothered me. She would write in it with such intensity, her pen moving in quick, urgent strokes, then snap it shut like she was trapping something dangerous inside. Once, when she got up to use the restroom, she left it on her seat. I found myself standing, moving toward it before I'd consciously decided to. But she returned before I could get close enough to see what was written there, and the look she gave me made my skin crawl with shame. After that, she started watching me too. The ferry route took us past a series of small islands, most uninhabited except for the occasional fishing shack or abandoned lighthouse. The The water between them was deep and dark, the kind of blue-black that makes you think about what might be moving far beneath the surface. On clear mornings, you could see all the way to the horizon, but more often the air was thick with mist that turned everything gray and uncertain. I began to notice things I'd missed before. The way the captain would slow the engines when we passed certain points, as if he were listening for something. How some passengers would move away from the windows during specific parts of the crossing, their faces turned inward, away from the water. The subtle changes in the ferry's rhythm that seemed to correspond with the depth of the channel below. The woman in the blue coat noticed these things too. I could tell by the way she would lift her head when the engines changed pitch, how her hand would pause in its writing when we passed through the deeper waters. She was mapping something, I realized, not the route that never changed, but something else, something that moved beneath the surface of our routine crossings. I started keeping my own notebook after that, not to copy her, I told myself, but to make sense of what I was seeing. The patterns that were emerging from weeks of careful observation, the way certain passengers would board on certain days, always with the same careful distance from each other, always with that same watchful quality I was beginning to recognize in myself. The entries started simple, weather conditions, passenger counts, notable conversations overheard, but gradually they became more focused, more specific. The woman in the blue coat appeared on every page, her movements tracked and analyzed like a specimen under glass. I wrote about the way she held her shoulders when the water was rough, how her breathing would change when we approached the deepest part of the channel. Reading back through those early entries now, I can see the obsession taking root. The way my handwriting grew smaller and more cramped as I tried to capture every detail, every nuance of behavior that might be significant. I was building a case, though I couldn't have said what crime I was investigating. The breakthrough came on a morning when the fog was so thick we could barely see the water. The ferry moved slowly, its foghorn calling out into the gray emptiness like a blind person tapping their way through an unfamiliar room. Most passengers stayed inside, but the woman in the blue coat stood at the rail, her face turned toward something I couldn't see. I moved closer, using the fog as cover, until I could hear her voice. She was speaking quietly, not to herself, but to someone or something in the water. Her words were too soft to make out, but the rhythm was familiar, like a prayer or a confession. When the fog lifted, there was nothing there, just the dark water and the distant smudge of an uninhabited island. But she kept talking, her lips moving in that same careful cadence, her hand gripping the rail with white knuckles. That's when I understood that she wasn't just a passenger. She was a pilgrim, making the same journey over and over, carrying something heavy and unspoken to the same place in the water. And I was no longer just watching her, I was being drawn into whatever current had caught her. I started timing my ferry trips to match hers, though I told myself it was coincidence. My schedule was flexible enough to allow for these adjustments, and there was something soothing about the predictability of her presence. She became an anchor point in days that otherwise felt shapeless and drift-prone. But predictability, I learned, can be its own kind of trap. The notebook entries grew more detailed, more invasive. I found myself noting what she wore, what she ate, how long she spent in the restroom. I sketched the patterns her fingers traced on the windows, tried to decode the expressions that crossed her face when she thought no one was looking. The boundary between observation and obsession blurred until I could no longer tell which side I was on. She knew, of course, how could she not? The ferry wasn't large enough for that kind of scrutiny to go unnoticed. But instead of confronting me or changing her routine, she began to perform for me. Subtle gestures that seemed designed to catch my attention, longer pauses at the rail where I could study her profile, deliberate movements that drew my eye to specific details. It was a dance, I realized, a careful choreography of watcher and watched, predator and prey, though I was no longer certain who was playing which role. The captain started watching both of us after that. I could feel his eyes tracking our movements from the wheelhouse, noting the careful distance we maintained, the way we orbited each other without ever directly interacting. He'd been making these crossings long enough to recognize the signs of something building beneath the surface of routine. One morning, when the water was particularly rough, he came down from the wheelhouse and stood near where I was sitting. He didn't say anything at first, just watched the waves through the salt-stained windows. Then, without looking at me, he spoke. "Some waters run deeper than others," he said, "and some currents are stronger than they appear." I asked him what he meant, but he just shook his head and returned to his post. The woman in the blue coat was watching us from across the cabin, her notebook closed in her lap, her fingers still tracing those invisible patterns on her thigh. That night I dreamed about drowning, not the violent, thrashing kind of drowning you see in movies, but a slow, gentle sinking into dark water that felt almost welcoming. In the dream, I could see the surface growing smaller and more distant above me, but I felt no urge to swim toward it. The deeper I sank, the more peaceful everything became. I woke with the taste of salt water in my mouth and the sound of the ferry's foghorn echoing in my ears, though I was miles inland in my own bed. The next morning, the woman in the blue coat wasn't on the ferry. I waited at her usual spot, watching the water through her window, but she never appeared. For the first time in weeks, I was alone with my observations, and the silence felt deafening. I found myself writing about her absence with the same intensity I'd written about her presence. The empty seat, the untraced patterns on the glass, the conversations with the water that weren't happening. My notebook filled with negative space, with the shape of something missing. She returned the following week, but something had changed. The blue coat was the same, the notebook was the same, but the quality of her attention had shifted. She no longer seemed to be watching the water with the same desperate focus. Instead, she was watching me. I realized then that I had become the thing being studied, the specimen under glass. The roles had reversed so gradually that I hadn't noticed the transition. Now I was the one being mapped and analyzed, my movements tracked and recorded in whatever system she was using to make sense of these crossings. The thought should have been disturbing, but instead it felt like relief. To be seen, truly seen, even by someone whose motives I couldn't understand, there was something almost sacred about it. I stopped trying to hide my observation and let her watch me watching her, creating a loop of attention that felt both intimate and dangerous. The captain noticed the change immediately. The careful distance we'd maintained collapsed into something more direct, more charged. We still didn't speak to each other, but the silence between us had weight now, substance. Other passengers began to avoid our section of the ferry, sensing something electric in the air that made them uncomfortable. I started having the drowning dream more frequently. Sometimes I was sinking alone, sometimes she was sinking beside me, her blue coat spreading around her like wings. We would descend together through layers of darker and darker water, our notebooks dissolving into clouds of ink that spelled out messages I could never quite read before I woke. The ferry route began to feel like a ritual, a repeated ceremony whose meaning I was only beginning to understand. Each crossing took us through the same sequence of depths and shallows, past the same uninhabited islands, through the same channels where the water changed color and the engines changed pitch. But repetition, I learned, can reveal things that single events hide. Patterns emerge from the accumulation of small variations, like a photograph developing slowly in chemical baths. I began to see that the other passengers weren't random travelers, but participants in something larger. They boarded and disembarked with the precision of actors following a script, their conversations timed to specific points in the crossing, their movements choreographed around invisible marks on the deck. The woman in the blue coat was the conductor of this strange orchestra, her presence the signal that kept everyone in their proper places. When she was absent, the entire rhythm of the crossing felt off, discordant. The other passengers seemed lost without her quiet authority to guide them. But I was no longer just a member of the audience. I had been promoted or demoted to a speaking role in whatever drama was unfolding on these waters. My observations had made me complicit. My attention had made me responsible for something I still didn't fully understand. The notebook entries from this period are almost illegible, the handwriting cramped and desperate. I was trying to capture something that kept slipping away, to hold on to meaning that dissolved as soon as I thought I'd grasped it. The pages are water-stained now, though I don't remember spilling anything on them. One morning, when the fog was particularly thick, the woman in the blue coat finally spoke to me. Not the murmured conversations with the water I'd overheard before, but direct words meant for my ears alone. "You've been very patient," she said, her voice barely audible above the sound of the engines. "Most people give up much sooner." I asked her what she meant, but she just smiled and returned to her window. The fog began to lift, revealing the familiar outline of the uninhabited island where she always directed her attention. But this time I thought I could see something there, a figure standing on the rocky shore, too distant to make out clearly. By the time I found my binoculars, the figure was gone. The woman in the blue coat was writing in her notebook again, her pen moving with the same urgent strokes I'd observed for so many weeks. But now I was certain she was writing about me. The crossing that day felt different from all the others, longer somehow, though the route was the same. The water seemed deeper, the islands more distant, the other passengers more withdrawn into their private purposes. I found myself gripping the rail the way she always did, my knuckles white with tension I couldn't name. When we docked, she was the first to disembark. I watched her walk down the gangplank in her blue coat, her notebook tucked under her arm, and I knew with absolute certainty that I would never see her again. But I was wrong about that, just as I'd been wrong about so many other things. She returned the next week, and the week after that, but now she brought others with her. People I'd never seen before, but who seemed to know exactly where to sit, exactly when to look toward the water, exactly how to participate in the ritual I'd been witnessing without understanding. I realized then that I had been recruited. My weeks of observation had been a kind of audition, and my obsession had qualified me for membership in something I still couldn't name. The woman in the blue coat would nod to me now when she boarded, a small acknowledgement of my new status. But membership came with obligations I hadn't anticipated. I found myself arriving at the dock earlier each day, staying later, taking crossings I didn't need to take. The ferry became less a means of transportation than a destination in itself, the journey more important than whatever lay at either end. My own notebook filled with entries that grew increasingly abstract. Instead of recording what I observed, I began writing what I felt, what I sensed moving beneath the surface of these repeated crossings. The words became more like poetry than documentation, full of images that made sense only in the context of dreams. The captain watched all of this with the patient attention of someone who had seen it happen many times before. I understood now why he had spoken to me about deep waters and strong currents. He was trying to warn me, in his indirect way, about what I was getting myself into. But warnings, I discovered, only make sense in retrospect. When you're caught in the current, all you can do is let it carry you where it wants to go. The drowning dreams became more frequent, more vivid. I began to look forward to them, to the peace that came with sinking deeper into dark water. The surface world felt increasingly insubstantial compared to the clarity I found in those underwater visions. I started bringing my notebook to bed, writing down what I could remember from the dreams before the details faded. The entries from this period are strange, full of references to things I'd never seen and places I'd never been. It was as if the dreams were showing me memories that belonged to someone else. The woman in the blue coat read over my shoulder one morning as I transcribed the previous night's dream. I didn't try to hide the notebook from her. Privacy had become meaningless between us. She nodded as she read, as if my dreams confirmed something she'd been expecting to see. "The water remembers everything," she said, "even things that haven't happened yet." I asked her what that meant, but she was already moving away, taking her position at the rail for the daily conversation with whatever lived beneath the surface of these waters. The uninhabited island began to feature more prominently in my dreams. I would find myself standing on its rocky shore, watching the ferry pass in the distance, seeing myself among the passengers pressed against the windows. The perspective shift was disorienting to be simultaneously on the boat and on the shore, observer and observed, participant and witness. In these dreams, the island wasn't uninhabited after all. There were others there, people I recognized from the ferry, but who looked different in this context. More substantial somehow, more real than their passenger selves. The woman in the blue coat was there too, but without her coat. She moved through the landscape like someone returning home after a long absence, her notebook unnecessary in a place where everything was already written down. I began to understand that the ferry wasn't taking us anywhere. It was bringing us back, over and over, to something we'd left behind or lost or never properly finished. The crossings were a kind of rehearsal for a performance that was always about to begin, but never quite started. The realization should have been frightening, but instead it felt like coming home. The surface world, my job, my apartment, my life on solid ground began to feel like the dream, while the ferry crossings felt increasingly real. I stopped getting off at my usual stop. Instead, I would ride back and forth, crossing and recrossing the same waters, watching the same islands appear and disappear in the mist. The woman in the blue coat approved of this change, I could tell. Her nods of acknowledgement became warmer, more welcoming. Other passengers began to do the same. The ferry became a floating community of people who had forgotten or chosen to forget whatever had originally brought them to these waters. We were all pilgrims now, making the same journey endlessly, carrying our private burdens to the deep places where such things could be safely deposited. The captain never questioned our new routines. He had seen this transformation before, I realized. The ferry had always been more than transportation. It was a kind of therapy, a moving meditation space where people could work through whatever was too heavy to carry on dry land. My notebook entries from this period are almost mystical in their abstraction. I wrote about the healing properties of repetitive motion, about the way water could absorb human sorrow, about the islands as repositories for memories too painful to keep but too important to completely forget. The woman in the blue coat began sharing passages from her own notebook. Her handwriting was smaller than mine, more controlled, but the content was surprisingly similar. She had been making these crossings for much longer than I had, carrying something that required constant attention, constant tending. "Some wounds need salt water to heal properly," she told me one morning as we stood together at the rail. "Fresh water isn't strong enough." I understood then that we were all wounded in some way, all carrying damage that could only be processed in the presence of deep water and endless horizons. The ferry was a hospital ship, and we were both patients and healers, treating each other through the simple act of bearing witness to each other's pain. The uninhabited island began to look less uninhabited, not because there were more people there, but because the people who were there became more visible. Figures standing on the shore, watching our passage with the patient attention of those who have learned to wait. I realized that some passengers never returned to the mainland. They completed their crossings by stepping off at the island, walking up the rocky beach to join the watchers on the shore. It wasn't death exactly, but it wasn't life as most people understood it either. The woman in the blue coat was preparing for that final crossing, I could tell. Her conversations with the water had become more intense, more urgent. She was negotiating something, working out the terms of a transaction I couldn't fully comprehend. I found myself both envious and terrified of her approaching departure. To be finished with the crossings, to have processed whatever burden had brought her to these waters in the first place, it seemed like the most desirable outcome imaginable. But it also meant letting go of the only community I'd ever found that understood the particular quality of my attention, my need to watch and be watched. The dreams began to include instructions, not explicit directions, but suggestions about how to prepare for the transition from passenger to resident, from seeker to finder. I would wake with the taste of salt water in my mouth and fragments of songs I'd never heard but somehow knew how to sing. My notebook became a kind of prayer book during this period. I wrote letters to the water, requests for guidance, confessions of fears I'd never spoken aloud. The pages became water-stained more frequently, though I was careful never to drink anything while writing. The woman in the blue coat read these entries with the attention of someone evaluating a student's progress. She would nod or shake her head slightly, indicating approval or suggesting revision. I learned to write for her as much as for myself, crafting entries that would meet her standards of honesty and precision. "You're almost ready," she told me one morning when the water was particularly calm. "Just a few more crossings." I asked her how she knew, but she just smiled and returned to her window. The uninhabited island was clearly visible that day, and I could see the figures on the shore waving to us as we passed. Some of them looked familiar, like passengers I remembered from earlier crossings who had simply stopped appearing one day. The captain watched our conversation from the wheelhouse, his expression unreadable. He had been making these crossings longer than anyone, I realized, but he had never joined the watchers on the shore. His role was different, more permanent. He was the ferryman, bound to the crossing itself rather than to any particular destination. I began to understand the full scope of what I had stumbled into. The ferry wasn't just transportation or therapy, it was a kind of sorting mechanism, a way for people to find their proper place in the geography of loss and recovery. Some passengers rode for a few crossings and then returned to their surface lives, satisfied with whatever healing they'd found. Others, like myself, were drawn deeper into the process, becoming part of the machinery that helped others navigate their own transitions. And some, like the woman in the blue coat, completed the full journey from passenger to resident, from seeker to guide, from living to something else that had no easy name. The notebook entries from my final weeks as a passenger are the most coherent I ever wrote. The approaching transition seemed to clarify my thinking, to strip away the confusion and obsession that had characterized my earlier observations. I could see the pattern now, the elegant system that had been operating around me all along. The woman in the blue coat began preparing me for her departure. She showed me how to read the subtle signs that indicated which passengers were ready for deeper engagement, how to recognize the difference between casual travelers and genuine seekers. She taught me the art of watching without intruding, of being present without imposing. "The water will tell you what you need to know," she said, "but you have to listen with more than your ears." I practiced the skills she showed me, apprenticing myself to the craft of guidance that she had mastered through years of patient crossings. Other passengers began to notice my new role, seeking me out for the kind of wordless support she had provided for so long. The dreams became less frequent but more intense. Instead of drowning, I dreamed of floating just beneath the surface, able to see both the world above and the world below with equal clarity. I was becoming amphibious, adapted to life in the liminal space between elements. My final crossing as a passenger came on a morning when the fog was so thick we seemed to be moving through clouds rather than over water. The woman in the blue coat stood at her usual place at the rail, But this time, she was wearing something different underneath, a dress the color of deep water, the kind of blue-black that makes you think about what moves in the spaces between light and darkness. She handed me her notebook as the ferry slowed for the approach to the uninhabited island. The pages were filled with observations spanning years of crossings, a record of every passenger who had made the transition from seeker to finder. My own name appeared near the end, with notes about my progress and readiness. "Your turn to watch," she said, and stepped over the rail into the fog. I didn't see her land, didn't hear a splash. The fog was too thick, the water too far below. But I knew she had reached the shore safely, had joined the community of watchers who helped guide others through the same process of transformation she had just completed. I took her place at the rail, feeling the weight of her notebook in my hands, understanding now why she had gripped the metal so tightly during all those crossings. The responsibility was enormous to see clearly, to watch patiently, to help others find their way to whatever healing they needed. The fog began to lift as we moved away from the island, revealing the familiar outlines of the route I had traveled so many times. But everything looked different now from this side of the transformation. I could see patterns I had missed before, connections between passengers that had been invisible from my previous perspective. The captain nodded to me from the wheelhouse, acknowledging my new role with the same patient attention he had shown my predecessor. He had watched this transition many times before, had seen passengers become guides, become residents in the endless cycle of loss and recovery that played out on these waters. I opened the notebook to a fresh page and began to write, not about what I observed, but about what I felt moving beneath the surface of observation itself. The currents that carried people to these crossings, the tides that determined when they were ready to move from seeking to finding to something beyond both. A new passenger caught my attention, a man in a gray jacket who sat near the starboard windows, his fingers tracing patterns on the glass while he watched the water. He had the same desperate focus I remembered from my early crossings, the same need to find meaning in the repetitive motion of the ferry through familiar waters. I moved closer, positioning myself where I could observe him without seeming to. He was carrying something heavy, I could tell. Some burden that required the particular kind of processing that only happened in the presence of deep water and endless horizons. The notebook felt warm in my hands as I began to document his movements, his expressions, the subtle signs that indicated his readiness for the deeper engagement that lay ahead. I was no longer just watching, I was shepherding, guiding him.